Behind a large clay jug with a wooden lid, brown eyes look intently peering at something. The face is framed by thick black hair. The inner voice of 18-year-old Sang thinks that the ghost of a beautiful girl lives in his house. Growing up behind large clay jugs, looking around and in his head replaying the story that his grandmother told him, namely that 3 years ago when he lived in another place he was beaten almost to death by bandits, and after that he lost his memory. He continues to hide, and on his face a frowning expression. Even when they see the scars on his face and body, he is overcome with horror. He remains sitting behind the jugs, hiding, waiting for the ghost, despite the fact that grandmother said that he had imagined or dreamed about it. But this was not the first time, and not the second time he had seen it. And for the first time he saw it in the darkness of the night. Then he stood completely sleepy. His shirt was unbuttoned and exposed his body, so that 3 dark lines could be seen running across his entire chest. Apparently he went out at night to take a leak. Suddenly his sleepy brain reacted to some rustling that was not inherent in the usual silence of the night. At first he looked down, continuing to do his job, and wondered if his stream had always been so strong. But then the rustling was repeated, and as if he had finally woken up, he turned to look at him. When he turned his head, he reacted with surprise and a loud sound to the girl who was standing in the darkness and pouring a bowl of water on herself. He gasped and could not take his eyes off the picture that rose before him. As if noticing someone else's gaze, she sharply looked around. The guy instantly covered his mouth with his hand, as if this could somehow disguise him, erase the loud, surprised cry of her memory, but he wondered if she had heard him. A girl with a calm expression on her face, with drops of water flowing down her face, looked back with thick brown hair flowing over her bare shoulders. The guy's eyes sparkled and a shy blush appeared on his cheeks. He opened his mouth in amazement, looking at the stranger at night. She abruptly pulled out a long white towel from somewhere, covering her from the uninvited boyish gaze. They continued to silently look at each other, the guy with surprise and an open mouth, and the girl with a calm expression on her face and a white towel on her shoulders. He clumsily rubbed the hair on the back of his head with his hand while continuing to blush, no laughing, saying that this is a good time to smoke weed, isn't it? He continued to stand in front of her in his open robe, and after his words the girl silently lowered her gaze because of the guy. He suddenly realized that after his night trip to the toilet, he had cleaned himself up like this, standing with his pants down to his feet and naked from the waist down in front of the girl. He screamed loudly. He began to pull up his pants in a panic, saying why they were sleeping, and began to make excuses to the girl, but she closed her eyes and looked away with an impenetrable expression on her face. Suddenly she changed her static position, moving her body and quickly running behind the guy. He didn't have time to understand what had happened when the girl knocked him out in one motion in front of his eyes, leaving him surprised and leaving traces of pink embarrassment on his cheeks. He turned to the girl, telling her to cut her hair, but he didn't have time and began to slowly sink to the ground, still holding his pants with his hands. He fell to the ground and, lying on the cool green grass with a stupid expression, he still could not understand what had just happened. But he did not have time to continue his thoughts as his eyes finally closed and he went into a state of oblivion caused by a precise blow from a stranger. The colorful rooster began his work at first light, marking the beginning of a new day, crowing his call against a sky outlined in pink, peach, and purple dawn. This cry immediately brought the guy to his senses, who sharply opened his eyes, raising his eyebrows upward. A long scar stretched across the bridge of his nose. He abruptly rose from the bed on which he was lying. He was made, and his shirt was still stretched out. His hair was disheveled. He was disoriented and confused from being awakened so abruptly from a sound sleep. He closed his eyes and, moaning, reached his hand to the back of his head, continuing to be in a half-sitting position in bed. Suddenly, in one swift movement, he reached for his pants, pulling them down and peering over the edges of the dark fabric with widened eyes. As if he realized something, he calmed down, thinking that it was all just a dream. Sangu went out into the yard and, standing with his feet on the ground, stretched sweetly, finally shaking off the remnants of the night's drowsiness. Behind him stood a wooden shack with a thatched roof. Not far from it stood large ceramic barrels. Just behind the house was a simple wooden fence that separated it from the rest of the yard. Continuing to stretch loudly, the guy did not notice how the figure of a girl came out of the house with a bowl in her hands. Her brown hair was tied back, and she herself was dressed in a simple white dress with a dark vest. Suddenly the girl stopped abruptly, looking in surprise at the guy, who was still rubbing his eyes with his fist, waking up from his sleep. He also looked at the girl sleepily. Having made out the person standing in front of him, he shouted loudly, turning to the girl, saying that it was her, pointing at her with his index finger. His eyebrows were slightly raised on the bridge of his nose and his face seemed indignant. Probably not expecting such a meeting and recognition, he tensed his eyebrows, excitedly opened his mouth as if about to say something and looked at the guy in surprise. Suddenly the expression in his eyes softens and a sparkle appears in his eyes. He states to himself that it was not a dream. The girl abruptly returns and enters the wooden door from which she had just come out, and the guy rushed after her, calling on her to wait. He stops before she can do so and the door closes in his face. He indignantly grabs the wooden handle. Yielding, the door opens wide with a creak, revealing to him a view of the room where the stranger had just run in, and the guy looks inside the house while continuing to hold the handle. When he looks inside, his gaze falls on a clean room where a lonely white table with benches, clay barrels, and kitchen utensils stood, but no sign of a living person except for his own shadow reflected on the wooden floor. He told himself in surprise that it was empty here. Not believing what he saw, with bulging eyes and raised eyebrows, he looked into the empty room as if hoping that the girl would jump out of there, and mentally told himself that she had disappeared. His expression from surprised abruptly changes to a serious eyebrow, frowning to himself that he is sure that it was a ghost. Emerging from the memories of the first meeting, he continues to cling to the wooden lid of the ceramic barrel with his hands, looking for a ghost. I say that he also steals various things. His figure froze in anticipation. The wind blew leaves falling from the trees. Everything remained unchanged. Someone shouted loudly, calling his name. Sanga snaps back with a startled expression. The voice belonged to an elderly woman in a white suit and dark vest. On her head she held a large basket of apples which she supported with both hands. She asked the guy what he was doing there. He was filled with confidence and determination and said that he was going to catch the ghost, only to tell him it was just a dream. The brunette, with a confident expression in his eyes, shouted that last night he saw her walking around the kitchen, and as soon as they saw each other she instantly disappeared. The woman, with a drop of sweat rolling down her forehead from the heavy load on her head, told him to stop it and take the basket because her neck was going to break. It was as if he only now realized what the woman meant and that she was holding the woman, and immediately stood up from his makeshift hiding place and approached the woman, helping her with the basket. As soon as he took the heavy burden in his hands, his face did not have a tense expression. He asked her why did she go to the mountains early in the morning if you know that he himself can do it. A little she simply asked him if he was hungry and invited him to eat and go to the market together. The guy behind her continued to hold the basket with a calm expression. But still trying to get to the bottom of the truth, he turned to her and asked if she thought that fairies and ghosts can be embarrassed. The woman, as if tired of such questions, asked what he meant. He simply explained that last time when they first met it seemed to him that that girl was embarrassed. Understanding flashed in the woman's eyes, and she silently turned away from the guy and blushed, while the guy's eyes acquired a joyful tint and he smiled. A small village was basking under the light of a clear sky. Wooden buildings lined up in rows with stalls where you could see a large amount of delicious food products and supplies. Some man near whom there were wooden wheels was tapping one of them with a hammer, repairing it. There was a wooden cart next to him. It looked like it was made by a craftsman. There was a young girl behind the other counter. There was a large amount of food on the table in front of her, and she herself stood by a smoking cauldron. In another corner stood a tall, strong man, a butcher, chopping pieces of meat with a sharp movement, and his entire pavilion was hung with animal products. In one of these corners, filled with life and work, a guy with black hair and a scar on the bridge of his nose was sitting on a bench, and an elderly woman was sitting on the edge of him, taking out something and putting it on a wooden surface. He called her like a grandmother. She asked what. Then he, with a completely innocent look, asked her like a child that apparently he had done something bad or wrong. The woman was silent, but his words alerted her. But rubbing his chin with his hand, the guy continued to think that if it weren't so, people wouldn't have beaten him to such a state that he was left with these huge scars, and if you look, he doesn't think that they appeared due to ordinary blows with sticks. It looked more like as if he had been pierced or cut with a sword or knife. The woman continues to be silent, with some sadness and understanding of his words. She simply looked forward. Suddenly that same strong man addressed him by name. Sanga returned to him with a final question. The grandmother continued to look ahead, holding the fabric bag in her hands. A butcher with 2 scars on his face said he couldn't do this anymore and offered to spill some water on the street. There's terrible dust everywhere. A young man with the same scars and a smile on his face agreed to this proposal. Quickly passing through a landscape of rocky rocks and green trees, the ambulance raced in front of each other. Horsemen had swords behind them, They had wide hats on their heads. Their faces were covered with dark scarves. One of the horsemen on the right face of which had black lines and his own blue eyes. They loudly approached the same with trading stalls. A heavy wooden bucket was placed on the dry ground with a crash in which poured clear water splashed. A guy and a man collecting water in small scoops splashed it along the street. The butcher turned to Sango, the girl herself, the ghost, continuing to water the street with water, asked what the man meant. Does he still see the guy? He simply replied that sometimes it's like that. With a sly expression on his face, he slightly covered his mouth with his hand and asked if she was beautiful, to which the guy enthusiastically replied that she was, and even very beautiful. Stopping at work, he looked at the man with a smile and said that she was good in herself, but when she looked out into the moonlight she became so beautiful that he even passed out. All this while listening to their conversation is a sitting grandmother whose face slowly becomes like a beet. The butcher just said with a smile that that's good, and the guy getting back to work asked what's best about her. She's still a ghost. The man, looking up at his thoughts, replied that even if she was a ghost, he would only like to see such a girl even if she was a ghost. A blush appeared on his face. Grandma herself also disappeared. You shouted loudly. You turned to him, Mr. Chung, and asked what he was talking to him about. The husband paused from his fantasies and looked sharply to the side. Shifting the conversation, he again took up the mug of water and said why there was so much dust. A heavy hoof stepped on the dry ground with a clatter. Drops of water splashed on it. The man spilled it. When the man looked up, riders were sitting on high horses right in front of him, looking ahead. A man with blue eyes and a weapon over his shoulders looked at the people in front of him. Mr. Chung's face took on a worried look, while the guy with thick black hair looked surprised and interested. The grandmother had been blushing a moment ago and was talking with the butcher. She acquired a serious look and looked at the strangers. With the appearance of the mysterious horseman, the atmosphere in the market changed. They loudly shouted for everyone to stay in their places. All the men behind the counters pulled out their knives as if expecting something. The cooks and artisans and craftsmen all held improvised weapons for protection. Hiss, looking at strangers, not understanding what's going on. A horseman with blue eyes and a strange scaly scar on the right side of his face said that they did not come here for them, and so that they would not stand like a pillar. Someone's strong hand was holding a wide meat knife at the ready. The blue-eyed horseman demanded that the head of this city come to them. A man timidly approached them with an innocent look, wiping his dirty hands with a handkerchief. The black stranger asked him if the man was the head of this city, and answered in the affirmative that it was him. The rider pulled out a large sheet of paper in front of the man and asked the head if he had seen this man. The man looked closely at what was depicted on the paper. It showed the face of an attractive girl with long hair tied back with a pointed pin. She was neatly dressed and had a serious look. The rider asked if the man had ever seen this woman. The man with a completely unreadable look replied that they had not seen her here. The horseman peered at him predatorily with his sharp gaze. Suddenly a guy with black tousled hair appeared behind him. He pointed to the portrait and blushing shouted in surprise, shouting that it was a ghost thief. The head of the city looked back in fear with his mouth wide open. The rider's gaze immediately changed. The man standing next to the guy immediately covered his mouth with his hand and chuckled nervously and said that ghosts don't exist, and the guy didn't need to apologize to the rider and said that sometimes things flicker for this guy. But the armed warrior no longer listened to him. He rushed forward, drawing his sword. The grandmother watched this in fear, calling a guy named Sangu. The sharp blade of the rider's weapon instantly appeared near the boy's neck. He looked fearfully at the metal near his face. The guy was suddenly caught by such strange behavior and fearfully put his hands in front of him, and the pencil standing next to him instinctively put his hand in front of the guy, protecting him. The horseman in the hat pointed a sword at the guy. The grandmother immediately joined them in front of the guy, pushing him back, blocking him with herself. She shouted to the stranger a dangerous thing away. Another man in a long white apron approached the warrior, trying to explain that the person they were looking for was not here, but the warrior suddenly changed the position of his hand, threatening his husband. The warrior continued to look menacingly at the young man and said that if he told them the whole truth, then no one would get hurt. The guy exhaled sadly and said in a trembling voice that he didn't know. The man widened his eyes and asked what he was saying. The guy continued to nervously look at the blade of the sword in front of him and said that he didn't see anything. Cold steel appeared on the guy's skin, pushing his thick hair away from his face. The man asked where he got such serious scars and how he got them. The man in the white apron said that he received them when he was beaten by street thugs at a young age. In the blink of an eye, the blue-eyed man swung his sword, cutting one strap of the man's apron, which now fell from one side of the man, widened in surprise and fear. The warrior stared at him with his blue eyes decorated with a scaly scar, and said that if he interfered in their conversation again he would die. The figure in the black hat again sharply returned to the guy so that he would say where he got these scars from, but the guy only said the same thing, that he doesn't know, but the warrior was not satisfied with such an answer, and he asked again that how come he doesn't know. His grandmother spoke in front of the guy again. She screamed that her grandson lost his memory when he was just a child. For this intervention, a guy near the woman received a blow from a guy near her, and the grandmother shouted loudly to her. The grandmother said sternly to the woman that he had not explained that he should not interfere, but he did not finish his sentence. His gaze widened in amazement at the elderly woman, but she held the part of her face that seemed to be falling away from a lizard, and she tried to detain her. He was surprised to think that it was a human mask. Sangu, not understanding what was happening, returned to his grandmother and said that there was something wrong with her face. Suddenly the woman pulled out a knife and hit the man in the chest. He suddenly recoiled. From such a blow, the man began to fall back, and people were armed with knives towards him. A man in a long white apron who called himself the head of the city grabbed the sword. He and the other people stood up from their seats, and holding his weapon ready, the man swore and said that it looked like they would have to run away again. And the black horseman, who until recently had been in a leading position and carried danger, now looked in surprise at the city residents who surrounded them. The head of the city confidently turned his head back, looking at the old woman with a wounded face, and, having made a decision, he then loudly gave commands to all the residents to kill the strangers. Peaceful peasants turned into soldiers armed with everything that was at hand and rushed at the uninvited guests in black. A butcher in a brown apron swung his sword in front of one of the horsemen as he advanced. He continued to strike, but the rider holding out his sword deflected the blow with a loud metallic clang. Now the horseman went on the offensive, and the man leaned back and fought back. The head of the city, holding a sword, is running at someone. With one stroke, a piece of the edge of his hat broke off for one of the riders. The mask tore and fell from his face, showing a long cut running through it. The dark-haired guy with his mouth open watched the action in embarrassment. People who just recently stood behind retail counters selling products and repairing various accessories were now jumping and fighting like real professional killers. A butcher with a shinker knife stood in front of the warrior, who could no longer stay on his feet and fell to his knees. Behind him stood a woman with a determined look on her face. Unable to hold on, the warrior fell to the ground, sprawled across the ground, and dark blood flowed from his wounds. After the enemies were dealt with, all the people stopped and returned to the old woman. She looked at them with a stern look, with her left hand holding a sheet of artificial skin on her face, which was torn off by the blow. She suddenly changed and became softer in her gaze. The woman addressed the townspeople and said that it seemed like they could no longer stay together, and thanked them for the work they had done. The dark-haired guy looked at the woman in surprise after these words. Mentally he was surprised because it didn't sound like Grandma's voice. The man in the white apron bowed his head sadly and said that it was nothing, and that they were sorry that they would not be able to stay with them because of their mistake. She answered her husband with a serious look that from now on they would all go to different places and start living their own lives, and ordered them to forget them. People looked at her and the head of the city, who he seemed to be, addressed her as a lady, and said that they would do everything as she ordered, and asked her to take care of herself. He approached the black-haired guy and, placing his hands on his shoulders with a soft smile, turned to him, "Sir," and wished him good luck, offering to meet again someday. Sang a strange woman who pretended to be a grandmother silently watched as people alone disappeared, impulsively jumping in different directions. The guy returned to the woman again, addressing her as a grandmother in his tone. He asked her for an explanation. Still not understanding the course of events, the woman looked at the guy, and their gaze became more lively, as if she was looking at a stupid baby. She grabbed his hand and pulled him forward, saying that she would explain everything after they got to a safe place. The guy asked in surprise what safe meant, and the woman again answered that they first just need to get out of here and everything else will come later. She pushed off the ground with all her might, picking up speed. Before the guy had time to come to his senses, they were already running through the air. He looked at her with his eyes wide open and his mouth wide open. The dog woman in turn continued to move above the ground as if it didn't mean anything. Their figures quickly disappeared over the green forest that enveloped the small settlement, which now remained empty. The guy screamed loudly and drawn out to his grandmother. As soon as they picked up speed and disappeared, nature remained standing, as if there had never been any signs of a living person there. It seemed that the trees also made a promise to remain silent about all events. After landing, the guy's stomach could not withstand such stress and forced him to throw his contents with breakfast outside. The Dark One was flushed with nausea and sweat appeared at the head of him. A woman with a soft look asked if he was okay and suggested that they just pack up and leave, but the guy objected with the words that he wanted to know what was happening and gave an ultimatum that until he found out he would not move a single step. Putting a dissatisfied expression on his face, he folded his hands on his chest and said that he should either tell or go without him. She lowered her eyes sadly, and real skin was still visible on her cheek through the realistic mask. She fell on her knees in front of the guy, causing him amazement, and told him to ask her whatever he wanted. The guy turned to her in confusion, waving his arms and surprised at this behavior. Lowering his eyebrows, he addressed her habitually, as if he were a grandmother, and then corrected himself and asked who she even was. She answered with humility that her name was Suyang. The guy tried to understand her and asked her name, holding it out to Suyang. The woman looked up at him and confirmed, saying that he didn't remember it now. She wanted to continue, but the guy abruptly interrupted them. He shouted loudly what kind of names these were, raising his eyebrows. The serious expression that he tried to give to his features fell asleep under the onslaught of his emotions. But suddenly he stopped yelling, his eyes widened in bewilderment, his eyebrows were drawn high to his forehead, and his mouth opened in a silent question. The woman began to slowly stand up, stretching out in height. The guy looked in shock at this picture in front of him, mentally saying that this was impossible and she was getting taller. Finishing her metamorphosis, she brings her hand to the edge of her hairline next to her ear, and with one sharp movement he tears off the artificial skin already damaged by the warrior's blow with one jerk, revealing his real face. Seeing this, the guy yelled in surprise. Now it was not the grandmother he knew who stood in front of him, and a young beautiful girl behind brown hair which was held in place by a long red hairpin. She looked like the girl from the Portrait of the Horseman and also like the stranger of the night. He frowned, poking her with his index finger and not believing everything he asked again that she was really the same ghost. She lowered her head and apologized that she had no choice but to disguise herself in order to protect him. She continued to explain that every night she used her acupuncture points, but the reason why he saw the real her at night was his internal energy, which was quickly restored, and therefore the duration of her technique was decreasing all the time. The guy's eyebrows furrowed. He asked what kind of internal force this was and who they even were. A girl with a strong posture stood in front of the guy. She had a sheath for daggers on her belt. Despite her strength, she meekly explained that she was indebted to him, and one day she promised that she would protect him and serve him with all her might. The guy's eyes softened, and he calmly asked what it meant to protect him and who he was. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly and her lips pursed. It was noticeable that she had difficulty explaining these things to the young man. He turned to her more confidently and sharply asked why she didn't answer who he was. Looking straight into his eyes, she replied that his name was Dongbang Mui. Muan and Mage are two of the strongest people in Murim who were once killed by him. In contrast to her words, the guy's face took on a funny expression like that of a confused child. He looked at her in surprise, as if she were crazy after these words. Already on the road, the guy repeats about himself the words the girl said to him, that supporters of those people are looking for him. It is clear that in order to kill him. He thought about what the girl said and constantly repeated Tunfan Mui about himself, trying to understand for himself that this was his real name. Mui could believe that he had killed not one but two of the strongest people in the world. His thoughts were stopped by a girl who was holding a brown piece of some food. She told him to eat it. The guy obediently extended his hand, taking what the girl offered him, and addressed her, calling her a ghost. The girl's face immediately darkened and her eyes narrowed in irritation. It seems that she is already tired of this guy's treatment. He said that he would not bombard her with questions, but she would have to answer some. The girl, whose face was hidden behind a transparent dark shawl flipping through the entire large hat on her head, told him to ask. He asked with a concerned expression why exactly he lost his memory. She tilted her head a little and explained that this was due to the fact that he was filled with unearthly power, for which he was not ready. The young man, frowning a little, asked, repeating her words, what kind of unearthly power overwhelmed him. He couldn't understand what she was talking about. The girl continued explaining that she didn't know the details, but before he lost consciousness and his memory, he gave her exactly these words, and that's why he forgot everything. These words did not please the young man. He lowered his gaze and his eyebrows rose tensely on the bridge of his nose. Then, with hope in his eyes and an uncertain smile, he asked if his memories would return. She calmly replied that she thought they would return, but only after some time. Mui's lips tensed, holding back the disappointment that caused her words. To calm down, he exhaled sharply, cleaning himself up and asking where they were going now. The guy and the girl stood and looked at each other in the middle of the sandy road, and around them were green hills with sparse trees and large stones. And she said that before he lost his memory, he was the one who made such decisions. He asked why she had such a doomed face, and do they really have nowhere to hide in the whole wide world? She patiently explained to the gentleman, as she called him, that no one would recognize him just by his face. But he has a completely different energy which makes him easy to spot. He clarified what kind of energy he was talking about. She creepily said that this is the energy of 1,000 deaths. The guy shuddered at this, not believing the repeated question he heard. What does she want to say with this? Did he really kill them all himself? After these, a chill seemed to pass through his body. And he himself felt this amazing creepy energy, remembering that he had already heard that they begin to kill almost from the cradle. He swore at himself, thinking that he was a man who from birth had uncontrollable demonic power, who mercilessly kills people. For only his thoughts were interrupted by the appeal of a girl who asked if they could already go to Nyagan. The guy asked again, not understanding what Nyagan was. She explained that she had heard that his grandfather lived in Nyagan, and perhaps his memories and powers would return if they went there. He interrupted her and, as if surprised by this fact, repeated the phrase that he had a family and his grandfather lived in Nyagan. The guy and girl continued to walk along the sandy path fenced with fences. The same travelers with luggage on their backs or in their hands passed near them. Above them lay an endless sky dotted with fluffy clouds. The girl came forward and the guy was a little behind. He looked at the people who looked at him with surprise and followed him with their gazes. He called the girl again, addressing her as if she were a ghost. The face of the veiled ghost tensed in irritation. She closed her eyes, clenching her hands into fists, and patiently asked him to call her Suyang. He eagerly agreed, pointing his hand towards the big wide tree, and said that he wanted them to rest a little, that he wanted to go to the toilet. The girl silently turned her head in the direction where the guy was pointing and was just about to say something. But he was already quickly pushing towards the tree, and the bag on his shoulders was shaking in time with his movements. As soon as he ran to the tree, he began to unwind the belts that held the edges of his light robe and exposed his wounded body. He immediately disappeared behind a tree and began to take off his clothes, suddenly gasping in amazement. While the guy remained standing, meanwhile, on the other side of the wide trunk, on one of the large roots of the tree, a girl was sitting. She asked why here, to which he replied that I don't even know. The guy was sorting out the edges of the strings of his pants and explained that he could barely make it all the way here. He stopped, distracted by a man who was sleeping, leaning his back on a tree, and to his right stood a katana. The man was of a strong build with pumped-up arms. His eyes were closed. He had thick red hair and a beard, and on the right side through his eye and cheek he had 2 deep scars. The guy continued walking, looking at the man with curiosity. Having reached a small dense bush, in order to relieve himself, the guy stood close to the leaves, continuing to look back at the man. The man, as if sensing someone else's gaze, lazily opened his eyes and turned to the guy, asking what he was muttering to himself. The guy didn't expect to be taken by surprise and widened his eyes at the man who was addressing him. He responded to the man by saying that his hair almost lost it. The man, continuing to hold his hands to his head, laughed sparingly. Did he really think that it would be better to die from a lightning strike? Sukyin, who had been sitting calmly on the other side of the tree all this time, immediately became alarmed as soon as she heard this. In one leap, skirting the tree, she rushed towards the guy. She stood in front of the red-haired man, folding her hands on her legs and bowing meekly, saying that she asked the gentleman for forgiveness. Mui, tying his robe back with a belt, looked at her in amazement. She grabbed the black-haired young man by the hand and told them to leave quickly, but he could not make it in time and did not understand anything, telling her to wait. From somewhere, the guy took out the same thin brown piece of food that the girl had given him before. He handed it to the man, to which he calmly asked what it was. The girl looked in fear at the guy's outstretched hand, and he told the redhead to eat it because he heard the man's stomach grumbling. The latter's face turned a little red. A light blush also appeared under the girl's eyes. She told the guy that the man was not a poor man, to which the black-haired man replied that he understood, but this man was clearly hungry. The man addressed the guy like a small child, saying that he apparently had never heard of respect for elders. He approached the man, took his hand, and with his own strength put the food back into his palms, and with a slight smile answered whatever he heard. The man continued to look at what the guy handed him, remembering what he had just taken. In the background, the girl asked the guy why he couldn't understand what she meant by A and was indignant that he didn't know that he shouldn't talk to strangers, and accelerated him. The girl returned, walking further away from the tree, and the guy remained a little behind, looking back again, as if trying to scan the tree to see the man behind him. She turned her head slightly towards him, saying that the guy should not worry and that person would not harm them. Muan asked in surprise if she knew him. She explained that she saw him for the first time but immediately realized that he was a bounty hunter. She stopped and continued that she had heard some people say that they were taking all the money. She drew out the last phrase, pausing as if understanding something for herself. The guy asked what happened. She turned to the left and told him to wait a little. The guy continues to look at her, and a question loomed in his eyes. If he remained in the same position, he was still chewing the treat that the boy handed him with his eyes closed. The girl disturbed the peace by addressing herself as Mr. Yongwa, also known as the red-headed ghost. She continued to stand and look down at the man sitting calmly by the tree, as if not paying attention to her. The girl peered into the man's face, remembering that the red-headed man, known for his steadfastness, did not bend even under the pressure of King Kwok Hong Ji. Then her gaze from the man slid to the weapon standing next to him, leaning on the barrel. It was a beautiful sword with red on the hilt and black patterns running across its blade. She remembered that it was called the Merciless Sword of Sorrow. And according to rumors, his strength is so great that he is able to cut even cast iron items that other hunters wear to protect their bodies. The husband finally opened his eyes and, continuing to chew, asked her what was the matter. She said in a decisive tone that she needed his help. They began to be bombarded with questions and answers. The husband asked what exactly it was needed for, and she explained that it was accompanied. Yodi, he asked with whose accompaniment. She explained that this concerns her master, who gave him dried meat. He specified the deadline for the assignment, to which he received an answer within 1 month. For a moment the man continued to silently eat the rest of the dried meat, pondering the offer. The girl waited patiently for the man's teeth to cope with this task. As soon as the man finished chewing, the girl looked at him expectantly. Finally, having finished his snack, the man swallowed. After finishing, he replied that he wanted 100 gold pieces for it. The girl, unable to hold back her emotions, loudly asked in surprise whether he was serious. He folded his hands on his chest and asked her what. Did she really think that this was a lot, and she thought that he would take a smaller amount? The girl looked at him intensely, telling herself that money was not a problem. The girl agreed without thinking for a long time, and the man with long red hair demanded an advance payment. After these words, the girl raised her eyebrows in despair. The awkwardly smiling girl lowered her head and hopefully suggested that maybe Mr. Yongwa would agree to make do with a receipt. The man, closing his eyes, immediately answered in the negative. The girl pouted offendedly, her cheeks turned red, and a drop of sweat dripped from her forehead from such a sharp response from the hunter. Then she asked if he would agree if she wrote her name there. She thought to herself that revealing her true identity and warrior name was very risky, but she had no other way to earn his trust. Yongwa calmly asked what her name was. She quickly answered Yale. The man barely frowned, saying that this was some kind of stupid thing. Is she really the daughter of Sintagwa Kensa? The girl silently confirmed his questions with her head. The man was silent. He wondered if she really was the new head of the Flying Thieves, replacing her father, who was killed by Muan. He stood up heavily, shaking off the dust from his clothes, and said that if he had known, he would have asked for much more. Yale asked what he meant. He stood opposite her and, now looking down at her, explained that even at the age of 16 he realized that the whole world would revolve around if you only had money and power, and if he knew who she was, he would have asked for much more money in order to live for your own pleasure. The girl immediately suggested that she could give more. He returned, raising his sword, and said that enough was enough and she shouldn't throw around such words. The girl asked again if he agreed. The man, with a slight smile on his face, replied that yes, but not because of her name, but simply because this boy gave a piece of meat to him, a stranger, and he really feels that someone like him will die immediately if he only points his finger at him. Touch, therefore you need to protect it. The girl smiled and said that in any case she was grateful to him. Hiding the sword behind his back, the hunter asked her where they were going. She answered that Nyagan. He walked out in front of her, walking forward. He turned to the girl saying that then they should leave and their agreement comes into force right now. Mui, like a small child, looked at the red one with delight, saying how big he was. Redhead addressed him calling him small and asked why there was nothing more to do except be surprised at his growth. But the guy didn't seem to hear him, continuing to ask if it was hot because all his clothes were so dark and thick and his hair was red. The guy made a sly look and asked what does he really think that he looks cooler this way. Yongwa replied that if he has nothing more to say then let him keep quiet. The guy held his husband's hand like a capricious son of his father and asked if he could call him Hyung and asked him not to refuse. And the husband said that no, it's impossible and he should call him Yongwa. Having stopped bothering the man, the guy ran up to the girl, touching her shoulder. She turned to him. He asked if it was true that she was a thief. She turned away from him blushing and said that the gentleman already knew the whole truth himself. The black-haired man raised his eyes, thoughtfully opening his mouth, and began rubbing the back of his head with his hand as if trying to remember what exactly he should know. The trio walked along a bright road surrounded by low green trees. In front of them stood a large crowd consisting of healthy, pumped-up men with weapons in their hands and with scars all over the body. One of them shouted to the head of the gang. He was a man with gray thick hair on one side and a shiny bald head on the other. On the right side of his face, a thick scar ran across his forehead and eye. He laughed hoarsely and said that he knew that someone would happen to him despite this heat, and turned to the other members of the gang, telling them to meet the guests. Suddenly the man's mood changed and he widened in surprise and fear. He looked at the Trinity and only he noticed the tall figure of the hunter and immediately recognized him as a red-headed ghost. Gang came out ahead. It was healthy-skinned and had a thick brown beard, calling out to the new arrivals. Behind him stood other men with sly and predatory grins looking at the trio. He was about to shout at them to stop, but a man with gray hair slapped him on the back of the head. He turned to his head in great surprise and asked what happened, but he just put his hand to his mouth and quietly told them about the red ghost. But the beard heard everything wrong, understanding his words as improvisation. He froze his eyes and a red blush appeared on his striped cheeks. He laughed and turned to his head, saying that they already had a clear plan of action. The gray-haired head with a gold earring in his ear fearfully repeated back about the red-headed ghost. After these words, the gang's mood changed dramatically. Drops of the hood, their eyes widened with fear. They all as one understood who the head was talking about, remembering the red-headed ghost. The trio almost approached the crowd blocking the road. The redhead looked at them with a calm expression on his face. As soon as they approached, all the men parted on different sides, making way for them. The man who called himself the head of the gang nervously looked at the sky, saying what a nice weather. Another with a long mustache answered him that indeed on such a day it would be just great to catch some wild boar and roast it on the fire. Mui looked at the men with incomprehension, thinking to himself what they meant when they called the weather good, because under such a sun you could get fried yourself. Yale and Yonha continued on their way while the guy was surprised to face a pack of robbers pretending to be a peace-loving people. He returned to the girl and asked if they were not bandits. She said that everything could be, but the guy asked again why they didn't touch them then. How they were simply afraid of their escort. Mui looked back at the red-headed man and asked what it meant to be scared. The redhead asked the guy why he was looking at him, and he simply asked that Hen was really such a good warrior and he didn't think that any of the locals could compare with him. As they walked, the scorching sun gave way to the warm rays of sunset, painting the sky in soft orange shades. The team reached a crowded city where there were trading pavilions here and there. Peasants, craftsmen, and sellers walked everywhere, each doing their own thing. The hunter, looking to the side with a smile, said that there must be at least someone here who wants to make money. They settled into a beautiful two-story guest house which was built of light and dark wood and decorated with red lanterns. The girl placed a bundle of orange and dark-colored fabric on the table. She turned to Muya, saying that she bought him a change of clothes and he could change after they left. He looked at him curiously. The red-haired man asked her if she bought something for him because she and the guy were not very similar in build. She answered with a smile that he could buy his own clothes, and how could Mr. Red Ghost not have money? He turned away looking up and said that he didn't have any money. Yale, continuing to smile innocently, took out a red bag tied with a string from somewhere and said that then it was probably not his. The hunter returned impulsively, addressing her sternly, calling her a girl. He abruptly tore the bag out of her hands, looking fearfully at the contents. She said that she only took one gold piece and he shouldn't worry because she would take this into account and give back even what they had been given before. The man irritably slammed his hand on the table and looked at her with full anger. The girl laughed lightly and said that his face looked as if he had drunk from salt water, and if only he could see how he was shaking through one gold. He turned red and the veins on his forehead stood out with tension. He pointed his finger at her and shouted that from that moment on she should not take one step closer to him. The girl widened her eyes and took a step back, smiling in amazement. But contrary to his words, he himself quickly jumped 3 steps back from them. Darky looked at him in surprise. The girl slyly squinted and watched the funny behavior of the red-headed ghost, and there was a smile on her lips. Evening gave way to night, and now, instead of the sun, a silver moon was shining in the sky, illuminating the clouds. The girl sat by the window and quietly drank tea from a white service. Satisfied with the drink, she looked at the cup with a soft gaze. Movement sat not far from her. He was already wearing a change of clothes which she bought with the red-headed money. The guy watched in surprise at such unusual behavior for a strict girl. He continued to look at her, thinking to himself that, in the moonlight, she really looked like a goddess. Feeling his gaze on her, she again raised the cup to her lips and turned her head so as to look back. The guy instantly blushed from such attention and from the fact that his peeping did not go unnoticed, so that she doesn't notice the streaks of red on his face. He sat on the bed, leaning behind him on his hands. The girl noticed. She just smiled cheerfully, narrowing her eyes. A moment later he returned to her again and already habitually addressed her, calling her a ghost. She put the cup on the table with irritation and corrected it, saying that she was Suyang. He quickly agreed and asked with full eyes of curiosity why she became a thief. She looked back at him with a sly gleam in her eyes and answered the question of why she couldn't do this. He immediately waved his hands, correcting himself and saying that this wasn't even cool, but shouldn't she have had a mentor who was a thief? She explained that her whole family was doing this because she and who she is. He continued, saying that it sounded like she was famous. The girls were immediately filled with pride and confidence and said with a smile that she was the best omen. She continued by saying that the people who protected him under Mount Jirio were also from the Doman clan. Filled with curiosity, he asked if the thieves knew martial arts. She raised her eyebrows and smilingly asked if he wanted to check. The guy peered at her carefully and nodded his head in agreement to her questions. She called him to her. Suyang placed a cup of water in front of her and dipped 2 fingers into it. She raised 2 fingers in front of her and said to watch her hand carefully. The guy was already sitting opposite her at the table and looking at the girl's actions. Muan continued to peer at her without noticing the small drops of water that appeared on his face. She kept holding 2 fingers in front of her, asking if he was looking carefully. He frowned a little, saying that even now he was very concentrated. She squinted her eyes a little with a smile and told him to touch her cheek now. The guy obediently raised his right hand to the left pike, touching the skin with his fingers. Suddenly he cried out loudly in surprise and at the same time looking at the hand in admiration. Closing her eyes, she proudly explained that this technique is called Gwi Kensam in honor of her father. The guy listened to her while continuing to look at the remains of water on his fingers, which he collected from his cheek. He delightedly widened his eyes and asked her to show it again. Suyang is clearly pleased with herself as she bows her head in agreement. She again extended 2 fingers to the bowl of water, soaking them up. Her hand appeared in front of Muan again, but this time his face took on a more serious expression and she repeated for him to watch carefully. He peered intently at her fingers, trying not to miss anything. But suddenly, after 1 second, he was already squinting from the splashes of water on his face. Dark-haired continued to frown with a drop of water running down his face. He turned away from her, blushing, and said that she was definitely a ghost. This time the girl was not annoyed by the gentleman's address to her, but simply snorted. Suyang laughed, cheerfully covering her face with her hand, and chestnut strands that had fallen out of her hair hung from both sides of her face. He looked at her with a tender expression on his face, and the pink color still adorned his skin. He enthusiastically turned to her, asking her to teach him this too. Dawn spreads over the spacious guest house, taking away the remnants of darkness. Birds were flying somewhere nearby, and peace and quiet reigned on the street. The 3 travelers were no longer sleeping. They sat in the dining room waiting for breakfast. Muan and Suyang sat opposite each other and looked at the red-headed man who sat alone 2 tables away from them. The hunter sat with his hands folded, not looking at them. Meanwhile, a woman with a food tray approached the couple. The guy looked at the dishes brought to them with a smile. The worker placed a plate of steaming buns in front of the girl. At that moment 3 armed men entered the hall. The girl turned around looking at them. The men had different colored clothes, but their faces had equally healthy noses. The red-headed hunter looked at them with a calm expression. He watched the men talking to the female worker and thought to himself that this must be Ik-do, Ik-hyun, and Ik-young. He stopped at the face of a bald man with thick short eyebrows who was dressed in blue clothes and realized that they were wanted in Edu. As the 3 brothers advanced looking around the room, he remembered that these guys were known for a long list of crimes they had committed and what they had done, from violence against women to brutal murders. About himself, that even if he received meager money for this task and not a whole bunch of gold, he had to be his clients and take care of their comfort. So he better not make a fuss here. As he brought a cup of hot tea to his lips, the brothers stopped staring at him in surprise. They all recognized him as the red-headed ghost. The man continued to drink his drink, thinking to himself that these guys were lucky. The brother in green clothes returned to them and quietly said that it seemed he didn't recognize them, so they would leave silently. They took their weapons, hiding her, and leaning forward, they began to leave the dining room with their backs, passing by a black-haired girl with brown hair. For a moment the girl smiled, turning to the men. She waved her hand and in a kind tone told them not to worry and to sit down and eat. The men's eyes widened in amazement. The men sat down silently at the table, placing their weapons next to them, bowing their heads with a doomed expression. Suyang and Mui looked at them in surprise. The 3 brothers sat with their backs to the man so he couldn't see how they turned their heads towards the guy and girl, and their teeth looked at them with hatred on their faces. All 3 of them were shaking slightly from tension. Suddenly the man in green clothes took a closer look and chuckled. His attention was drawn to a guy with tousled black hair sitting opposite the girl. The robber thought to himself that this guy was the same age and also had the same scars on his face. Then he turned his gaze to the girl and remembered that she was the one that Emperor Muan was looking for. The Chervo hunter looked sternly at their side, observing the actions of the uninvited guests. As if sensing his attentive gaze, the 3 brothers immediately stood up from the table and took their weapons. The man in green clothes was unhappy and said that they had just arrived, but the brother in brown clothes told him to shut up. The red-haired hunter stood up, raising his sword. At that time the robber brothers had already begun to quickly flee from the pavilion. Yongwa picked up his sword and slung it over his shoulder. Passing by the guy who was having breakfast, he said that he would be back soon. The brothers in multicolored clothes, holding their swords in their hands, quickly picked up the pace as they ran past the green trees. They were running away from the hunter. The brother in blue turned around and said that it seemed he had noticed them. The brother in green said that for now they were just running away and he knew how to get rid of this demon. The brother in blue asked what they should do. He asked the green brother if he had seen the boy next to him, because for sure he didn't have time to finish. All 3 stopped abruptly, eyes wide and trembling with fear. In front of them stood the famous red-headed ghost. Holding his own in his right hand, he asked what exactly he probably meant. They stood in front of him, hiding their hands with swords a little behind. The man in green clothes began to sweat and said that he didn't mean anything like that. The red-haired one said that after all they were treated to it because he tried to pretend that he did not recognize them, but they were very noisy, and such a sin cannot be ignored, he said, laughing at the end. The man in green clenched his teeth in irritation, looking at the hunter. All 3 took a fighting stance, raising their weapons in front of them and acquiring a warlike expression. They eagerly watched the enemy. Green brother with a gloomy expression on his face. He thought to himself that the main thing is not to panic, because they will fight a long battle. No matter how good a warrior he is still mortal, and if they stall for time, sooner or later he will run out of steam and they can win. The brother in blue looked at his opponent with a doomed expression. His face was dripping with excitement. At that time the brother in brown, who had a high forehead and long hair, was shaking with fear. He clenched his teeth and looked at the redhead. The hunter grabbed his sword tighter by the hilt, from the end of which hung a keychain with red fur. As soon as he did this, the blade of the sword turned from ordinary to a red-hot color and began to glow. A light haze swirled around the figure of a man ready for battle. The brother in green clothes looked at this, and the brother in blue widened one eye in fear. Before the redhead could blink his eye, the hunter suddenly approached them, swinging his red sword. The brother in brown widened his eyes in fear. The swing of the sword created a powerful energy wave that the 3 brothers could barely contain with simple iron weapons. The brother in green staggered, holding his sword with his other hand. Splashes of dark, thick blood flew past. The same thing happened with the bald brother in blue who closed his eyes from tension and did not notice the dark liquid flying around. He barely had time to break, pressing in and sliding his dark boots along the ground, causing a wave of dust. The brother in brown coughed and thick hot blood flowed from his mouth and throat, framed by a thin cut. The man in green face, also wounded, returned, turning to his brother, who was no longer able to stand, having fallen to his knees, pouring blood on the grass. He pursed his lips and was shaking. The robber thought that he was never able to master complex techniques. Meanwhile, the hunter stood as if nothing had happened and said that he could get 20 gold for the two of them, but this was just a waste of time. He pointed with his sword, the blade of which had returned to normal, at the remaining two standing. They were afraid of their weapons in front of them, and a dark liquid was flowing down their bodies. Something caught the redhead's attention. He quickly returned to the source of his alarm, holding his trusty sword near him. A man with a bald spot on the top of his head and black hair, a gold earring hanging from the edges of his ear, was rushing towards him, picking up speed. The man's eyes and hands glowed with light. Yongwa watched him, eyes wide in bewilderment. Without waiting, he instantly swung his blade, which again glowed with a bright red light. It was very timely, because just at that moment the man running towards him stopped and, putting his hands in front of him, sent a bright green sphere at him. The two forces collided, causing a surge of energy that affected everything around. After the haze cleared, the figure of a man with long red hair remained on his feet, having been driven across the ground by a powerful blow. He continued to hold the sword in front of him, and behind him a cloak was developing, torn in shreds from below. The man's dusty curtain gradually disappeared, and he, with an impenetrable expression on his face, continued to stand and peer at the enemy, waiting for his further actions. The stranger with black hair chuckled, and behind him dust and dirt settled down, caused by a surge of energy. The two brothers with cuts on their faces unanimously called him mentor and smiled, rejoicing at his arrival. He turned his head sharply, looking sternly at them. They instantly shrank under his sharp gaze and immediately fell silent, removing the smiles from their faces. The newcomer turned to his opponent, wondering if this little guy was the red-headed ghost. The red-haired man smiled at the baby's address in his direction. He said that then it turns out that he is none other than their elder mentor. The stranger's gaze became sharper and his temples throbbed with suppressed irritation. The brother in green menacingly addressed Yongwa, saying that he was a rude man and that their mentor was the first of the three great masters of Kurion. The hunter fell silent, looking sternly at them and remembering that Choban was the first, and he heard that he was the most famous of all three masters. Yongwa turned to his husband, to his elders, and that he had no complaints against him. So why did he attack him? The husband smiled and said that he himself would punish his students for their sins, and no one had the right to touch the students of the first master. The red-headed ghost only grinned at the phrase the stranger said. He raised his sword, which began to glow red, and said that it didn't matter whether he was on their side or not. He attacked him, and therefore the hunter has the right to rip his stomach open. He raised his sword higher, and its blade was already completely enveloped in a red glow. Red said that usually he does not waste his strength and time on a fight if he is not paid for it, but he is so famous and arrogant that it is time to give his guts some time in the fresh air. The man's face took on a crazy look. He looked at the weapon in the man's hands and said that this could really be the merciless sword of sorrow. The red head confirmed his words and said that he would free him from the burden of punishing his beloved students, who are the scum of this world. The black-haired man said that his sword was certainly good, but his was even better, and expecting a good fight, he laughed, looking at his red opponent. He continued to laugh and told them to finish this quickly. Along with these words, the man's eyes began to glow green again and bright lightning appeared. The hunter only confidently answered him so that he would not regret it. The man whose body was enveloped in green light suddenly rushed at the red-headed one with a predatory grin, and he in turn swung his reddened sword in response. Without waiting for long, the men began their crazy duel. Their swords collided with each other, scattering a scattering of powerful bright energy around them. Yongwa's gaze became stern and burning sparks were reflected in his pupil. He looked at the enemy without looking away and watching every step. His opponent continued to smile, wildly sparkling in person with a green glow. The red-headed ghost held his weapon tightly, vibrating from the powerful blows. He skillfully fought off the weapons of a man who also knew his job well. Orange flashes appeared where their swords collided. The men continued their crazy battle dance, not noticing anything or anyone, and at this time the two surviving brothers were watching them but with traces of cuts on their skin. Streams of blood flowed down their stone faces which had already begun to dry, forming a crust. They held their swords as if expecting an attack or preparing to engage in battle. But after a moment they turned in the opposite direction and rushed away from the battlefield. The brother in blue asked the other where they were, and he called him an idiot, asking if he really wanted the mentor to finish them off right here. He turned his head and irritably asked the confused bald brother if he had not noticed the girl sitting with that boy in the tavern. The bald man continued to remain silent, not understanding what his black-haired relative was leading to. He smiled, distorting his lips on one side, and calling the bald man a fool reminded them by asking that their mentor liked pretty girls most of all, and then asked a leading question about whether that girl was pretty. Finally understanding what the thing was about, the bald man smiled joyfully like a child who had guessed where the candy was. The brother in green frowned and thought that their mentor would then definitely try to tear them off one ending for this, so they simply had to catch that beauty and give it to him. They continued to run until the bald brother asked in surprise, looking at the road, if they were not standing. The man in green followed in surprise what he was told. He froze for a moment, an unexpected meeting. Along a wide grass-free road, two figures were heading towards them. They belonged to a guy with thick messy black hair and a girl wearing a wide hat with a shawl that covered her face. The man in green grinned joyfully and said that it was incredible that they themselves came here. He laughed, saying that it was very convenient for them. The girl's hand fell and squeezed Mui's gray fabric with her fingers, forcing him to stop. The guy returned, looking at her with a silent question. She, continuing to hold him by the shirt, intensely peered at the figures of the men in front of them. Without saying a word, she continued to look at them, and the guy seemed to read her thoughts and understood what she meant, and now also watched the robbers. Two brothers with predatory grins raised them in front of them and began to step on them. The brother in green addressed the girl with feigned courtesy, calling her a sweet beauty, and asking if she knew that she should go with them. Wahayanga's face just barely frowned, and the guy to her left indignantly shouted at the men, why would she do this? The robber seems to have just noticed the guy next to her and therefore only glides over his figure with an exhausted gaze. The bald brother with a cut on the bridge of his nose looks at the other with a silent question, and the latter, understanding what he is thinking about the bald one, only nods affirmatively. Resolution. The man in blue raises the sword above himself, shouting, calling the guy worthless as he runs at him. Mui looks at him anxiously, not expecting such a swift attack. But Wahayang manages to react by sharply turning his head in his direction. The acquired reflexes are triggered, and she quickly jumps out in front of the guy, covering him and deflecting a health blow with her sword. The husband didn't even have time to react. His eyebrows rose in bewilderment, and his eyes did not even notice how splashes of dark blood flew past him. The man who has stopped grabs his working wounded hand, on which the stress has emerged, with his left, and roars in pain. The man in green anxiously returns to the bald man, calling him his second brother. The dark fabric of the trousers the girl was wearing had a bright line with a blue tint. This line turned out to be her sword, which she held in her hand, and with which she repelled her husband's blow. The black-haired robber came up and put his hand on the shoulder of his brother, whose whole face was sweating from pain. Vi stuck out his lower lip and looked at the girl and the unusual weapon in her hand with a sultry grimace. She strictly said that no one is allowed to make an attempt on the life of this young man. The dark-haired robber looked at her furiously and cursed briefly, calling the girl nasty. He left his brother behind and stepped in front of him and grabbed the sword with both hands. With a belligerent expression, he roared that she could not cope with both of them. As soon as he said this, the airspace near them was cut through by two bright light arrows which had the same bluish glow as the sword of Suyang. The husband didn't even have time to say anything, leaving him standing with his mouth open. A bright flash flew past. As it turned out, these were light arrows that the girl fired. One of them hit her husband in the head, piercing it right through his forehead, and the one that flew near his shoulder was intended for his brother and passed through his skull in the same way. Two flashes passed the men behind, leaving behind splashes of thick blood, and having fulfilled their function, they arced at each other and returned back. They returned to the girl's hands and quickly grabbed them. That's how the two light arrows turned into ordinary metal daggers, leaving behind a ghostly light of a blue hue. It hid the daggers in its belt, and the guy standing in front of her exclaimed in admiration. In front of them, two bodies that belonged to the robber brothers lay motionless on the ground, and a puddle of dark red liquid was spilling near them. Mui returned to the girl and said with an enthusiastic tone that it was incredible and then asked why it flashed by so quickly and killed them in a second. The girl embarrassedly replied that she would tell him later. She turned her gaze back to the bodies, speaking to herself mentally. What does it feel like someone with powerful energy is confronting a red-headed ghost very close by, and if this is true? So after all, there was a man capable of resisting him. She wondered if it was worth the risk to go there and if it was better to avoid danger. Mui was distracted from her by looking somewhere to the side with curiosity. He said that it seemed like two people were fighting somewhere near them. The girl asked a little hesitantly if the pan felt their energy. He smiled cheerfully and waved his hand. He invited her to go there, said that one of them is very confident in himself and that's why he wanted to go and look at his skills. With slight admiration, Suyang looked at the young man, realizing that his abilities were returning. But she immediately added that he still doesn't remember anything, but he can already feel the energy of living creatures at a short distance, which means that his power is returning. She was pulled out of her thoughts by the voice of a guy who told her to hurry up. In the valley where the men fought, a crazy action took place. Near them, dust flew in a cloud which was raised by their powerful blows, and flashes of yellow-green light bounced off their swords. The brothers' mentor, a man with a bald head and black hair at the back of his head, rolled backwards on the ground, barely able to stay on his feet, leaving shoe prints on the ground behind him. He was exhausted. Sweat was running down his face, and thin trails of blood were flowing from the wound on his cheek and from the corner of his mouth. He breathed heavily, amazed at the strength of this boy. This boy, who he called the red-headed ghost, stood confidently holding his trusty sword in his hand. He laughed, mocking the man, jokingly calling him a mentor and asking if it was time for Tom to give up. The man he was addressing gritted his teeth in rage, calling the redhead a damn freak. He still could not understand his strange fighting style, noting about himself that it was not infinite. While the man was thinking, the red-headed ghost rushed at him with all his might, now fully answering to his name. Hot iron burned in his eyes, and he rushed at the robber with his arm outstretched. So much so that the robber barely had time to place a block. The green aura that surrounded him with powerful energy at the beginning began to decrease, leaving behind only small green lightning. Sparks flashed between their weapons from the blows. The black-haired man tensed his whole body. Fatigue and panic were visible in his eyes. He thought to himself that there was no way he could reach the hunter. The red-headed ghost seemed to have entered a state of combat trance. The red glow completely covered his eyes as he continued to strike with his sword. At some point he swung sharply and threw the robber back with one powerful sweeping blow. And he flew away with a groan. The robber landed roughly, his back crashing into the tree behind him. His sword fell from his hands, and the painful blow tore some of the air from his lungs. Without stopping for a moment, the ghost called out to him in his battle dance, understandable only to him, swinging for the next blow. The bald mentor wondered in fear what was happening. Approaching, the hunter repeated the previous wide blow. A sharp blade enhanced by magical energy in a second slightly cut the strong tree trunk, and at the same time the body of the man who had resisted it before. The hunter only looked down in surprise. His eyes widened in horror as he saw the results of the mad fighter's blow. His entire body was cut in half in a careful, even line. In his hand he continued to squeeze the hilt of the sword, which turned into a stump. His blade fell away after being cut by a powerful blow. After the last blow he put an end to their fight. For a moment there was silence, and the only sound spreading across the clearing was the melody of leaves that rustled from the tree with the wind. Yongwa calmly watched as the tree, still firmly on the ground, collapsed along with his blow. His silent observation was broken by the enthusiastic voice of a young man who stood next to the girl in the hat and watched all this action. Behind the man, a felled tree lay sprawled on the ground. After the end of the fight, the man cleaned himself up. His wounded hand spoke from the ear with a piece of some kind of fabric. Yongwa thanked him sparingly. He sat on a large rock, twisting his hand, checking it for other injuries. The girl kindly handed him an apple, telling him to eat a little. At this time Muan stood next to them, holding an apple in one hand and with the other folding his middle and index fingers side by side, quickly moving his hands back and forth. Yongwa looked back at him, asking what he was doing. But the young man put the apples in his mouth and now tried to repeat these movements with both hands. Having bitten off a piece of the apple, He took it out of his mouth and explained to the man that he was repeating the techniques of Gua-Kensu. Something shot through the red-headed man's head, and he stared at the guy with fear. He stood up, moving away from them, and told the guy that if he was there too, he should not approach him again. The guy put the apples in his mouth again, and frowning from tension, he continued to repeat the movements. Suddenly his look changed to panic and his iris became cloudy. The apple he was holding in his mouth fell out of him, and the guy clutching his stomach with both hands began coughing furiously. His face turned red and sweat appeared on his skin. Suyang looked at him in alarm, asking what happened to him. The guy couldn't answer. Tense blood vessels appeared under his face. Saliva flowed from his mouth and he began to shake. He sank to his knees on the ground, unable to stay on his feet. A girl ran up to him, grabbing his chest with one hand and placing the other on his back. This noise attracted the attention of the red-headed hunter. He turned warily over his shoulder to see what was happening. Unable to breathe or function normally, the guy continued to choke with his mouth wide open. The hunter immediately appeared next to them, crouching on one knee. He couldn't understand what happened. And why is this happening? The girl was simply trying to call out to the gentleman arched on the ground. The guy rested his head on the ground and his body rose in a twisting arc. Saliva continued to flow from his mouth and the whites of his wide-open eyes turned red. Thoughts that his name was Tong Fan Mui constantly arose in his head, and he also tried to remember his father's name. Questions kept popping up in his delirious mind. He remembered who his mentor was, and his brain gave him the name Cleaver Soul. Remembering this, he panicked, thinking that he could not be saved. Near the powerful high mountains lies a wide forest covered with thick snow. The branches of the trees were covered with silvery frost from the frost. In this forest, among thin tree trunks, a child's figure sat alone on a stone protruding from the snow. It was little Mui. Near him lay the dead bodies of birds, staining the white snow red with blood. The boy sat on a stone waiting, putting his small hands together. He was waiting for a man and was indignant about where he was and how many men were waiting for him. As he spoke, it left his mouth. To his right, at his feet, lay a sharp knife. The leaves that had long fallen from the trees, leaving them standing bare, were covered with a layer of snow. Someone's careful steps on this carpet caused a rustling sound. The boy immediately returned to the sound, ungluing his hands from each other. He immediately rose from the stone, grabbing a knife in his hand, and began to peer into the bright lights of the eyes looking at him from the dark forest. Having walked a little further forward, the lord of these bright eyes came out of the forest to the guy. It was a big snow tiger. The dark-haired boy was delighted to see him, and turning to the animal said that they should quickly finish this because he was already dying of cold and hunger. The tiger did not take into account the guy's words, continuing to gracefully move his large paws forward as he approached the child. He did not go straight at him but began to walk around him. He became noticeably nervous and asked the animal why he was so healthy. The tiger did not answer but only watched the guy. With each exhalation, steam came out of his nostrils. The boy smiled brazenly and said that he really wanted to deal with him as soon as possible because someone had not seen wolves for several months and they would definitely like his meat. He continued to hold the knife in his left hand, and with his right hand he picked up the carcass of a dead bird from the ground and began to call the animal to him. He pushed the bird's head into his belt so that it rested on it and hung freely. He kept repeating this with others. The snow animal's eyes took on a dangerous hue. His mouth opened with a growl, revealing sharp white fangs. Mui continued to threaten the huge tiger's small knife and gradually retreated back without breaking eye contact. Suddenly his right foot slid backwards on the snow-covered grass. He gasped in surprise and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple with excitement. The tiger suddenly rushed at the guy with a loud roar. He in turn, without releasing the knife from his hands, turned around, continuing to look at the fur enemy. But as soon as the tiger lunged forward, picking up speed, the guy began to quickly run away from him, shouting that today he would catch him and was well prepared. And on the snow-covered ground, the lid of a small hatch rose and 3 pairs of dark human eyes looked out of it. Suddenly people saw the picture unfolding in front of them. The first voice asked in fear what was happening there, and the second added an almost demonic tiger there. 3 people were sitting under a camouflaged hatch. The second figure in red and gray clothes held the lid and watched the animal with an open mouth, asking if they could eat it. The man in the brown outfit grabbed him by the arm and told him to stop because if they came out of hiding now they would die. The man in the red-gray outfit looked back at the other with a disappointed face trying to object, but the other interrupted him saying that there was nothing to be done about it, and he had to hope for luck, and it would be good if the guy managed to run to the trap. Meanwhile, Mui quickly ran along the snowy road from the aggressive animal. With each of his heavy exhalations, clouds of steam formed near him. He shouted in an irritated tone that those figures who were hiding underground could at least shoot with a bow and distract the beast. 3 pairs of eyes that looked out of the darkness tensed at the guy's words. Instead of helping, on the contrary, they quickly covered themselves with camouflage while hiding. The guy with irritation called them cowards and continued his movement on his own. The guy quickly found a spot on the ground between 2 thin trees and thought that the trap was still about 3 states away. He looked back at his pursuer thinking that he would probably catch him first, but then interrupted these pessimistic thoughts by telling himself that he had no choice but to run as fast as he could, and if he delayed for even a second he would be torn to pieces. The guy resolutely turned to face the tiger, forcing him to sharply slow down the oath on his giant hind legs. The guy continued to breathe quickly, trying to compensate for the lack of air that he had during the long run. The tiger stared at the guy with his sky-blue iris. Despite the fear, the guy put on a menacing look on his face and loudly addressed the animal, "Why, and just look, and if it wants to eat him, then let him start." In contrast to his loud and decisive tone, his hand in which he held the dagger tightly was shaking violently. As if sensing fear, the animal lost the strange stupor that had arisen in it and was already boldly advancing on the guy, who with his hands out in front of him was trying to retreat with his back. He quickly looked back towards the trap site, thinking that he was almost there. Snatching it with his gaze, he sharply turned around and ran, and behind him, again baring his sharp teeth, the snow tiger was approaching. They broke the winter slumber of the snow-covered forest by continuing their games of racing. In the blink of an eye, little Mui suddenly pushed himself off the ground, jumping up and down. His jump, which was more like flying, lifted him up where he, like a bird, tried to continue running in the air. And after him, repeating this jump, the white beast rushed. The striped one threw his paw at the guy's back, knocking him off course, and his razor-sharp claws cut through clothing and skin. The guy started to fall, and behind him small drops of dark blood scattered in the air. His face twisted into a grimace of pain. He fell into the snow, but his main goal was achieved. The beast behind him fell straight into a snow-covered trap with a loud sound. The guy fell into the snow due to the inertia of the animal's blow and rolled over him. Stopping, he immediately knelt down and looked back to stun his work. He exhaled with relief and the thought that he had succeeded. He carefully began to approach the trap where the snow monster was sitting. He approached her little by little, not forgetting to keep the dagger near him. A slight blush appeared on his plump cheeks, and he himself smiled, pleased with what he saw. He stood straight up to his full height and loudly, with pride in his voice, shouted to the striped one that he really still thought that he could eat him. Having completed the victorious celebration with a barely furrowed brow, he turned to the 3 pairs of eyes that were once again looking out of their vault and told them to come out quickly. The tiger rushed helplessly around the pit, crouching in an attempt to jump out of it. He continued to grind his teeth and growl loudly. Now the guy had 3 men standing next to the trap, holding a spear in their hands, which consisted of a long wooden stick to which a sharp metal tip was tied. They timidly looked inside. The guy irritably threw at them. They need to quickly kill him with spears. The men looked at Mui in confusion, agreeing with the little commander. All 3 stood at the edge of the pit and pointed their weapons at the animal inside. A man with a brown mustache turned to the others, saying that the animal's skin was probably very expensive, so they should aim very nicely and be careful. The beast continued to growl furiously with its long, strong tail while looking at the 3 sharp blades aimed at it. The kid loudly gave them the command to start, and the men all threw spears at the tiger. Landscapes of snow-capped mountains and hills with once green trees stood in winter silence until it was broken by the loud cry of a man. He was indignant about whether his partner even knew how to use a spear. And another of them was loudly surprised that the tiger began to salivate and began to think that the animal wanted to eat them, and after such an assumption he ordered the others to bring more copies. The men continued their work, dismantling wooden weapons and passing them to each other. Suddenly the snowy beast jumps out of its trap with one powerful jerk, finding itself free. His eyes glowed and blood was oozing from his skin. He did not take it into account, furiously attacking people. The men could not understand how this happened. The little guy clenched his teeth, fearfully looking at his former victim, who was now freed from captivity. The white tiger hit the man with the brown mustache in the face. After the beast was finished with him, he returned and attacked another man who put a spear in front of him, holding it with both hands and trying to protect himself from the enraged animal. But such an obstacle was nothing for the powerful tiger. He got rid of the stick and furiously grabbed the man's throat, gnawing him. He continued to hold on to his wide mouth with all his strength and lifted him into the air, tearing him apart. Meanwhile, a man in gray and red clothes was running behind him with a weapon. He managed to drive the blade into the striped beast's body, breaking through its thick skin. The tiger turned sharply to the brave man and with eyes full of pain and rage growled loudly. The man froze in a stupor, clenching his teeth in fear and looking at his death. The tiger stood on its hind legs and grabbed the man's shoulders with its front legs, biting into his head. He only managed to croak out a strangled sound. The enraged animal continued to furiously tear the men's bodies into small pieces, spattering its snow-white fur and the ground with splashes of thick human blood. The guy who watched all this time with fear and panic at the animal, wondering if it was the end for them all. As soon as he thought so, the body of the animal from which the spear was peeking out, and having finished with the men, now turned its bloody mouth towards the guy who lured it into this trap. He boldly raised the knife in front of him, calling the tiger to him with the thought that he was not going to die alone. Unable to hold back any longer, Vadim rushed towards the guy, who bravely continued to stand on two legs and with a knife in his hand. The animal, which until recently had nobly walked through the forests merging with the white landscape, now looked like a terrible monster. Her eyes were covered with loot, and from the side where the protruding spear was sticking out, blood continued to squelch. She pulled out her huge paws with a fan of sharp claws in front of her and pointed them at Mui, who humbly closed his eyes and awaited his fate. Having finally reached its goal, the snow-white tiger grabbed the guy's shoulder with its sharp fangs, knocking him over. Mui's eyes opened despite the severe pain, his eyebrows tightly knitted together. He raised the hand in which he held his dagger and with all his might thrust it into the animal's body. They both fell into the snow. Darky, with the same sharp movement, took the blade out of the body of the animal, which had already begun to go limp on him. The guy let out a strained roar as the blood of the animal poured out of the hole that was formed as a result of the cut. Covered all the boy's clothes, his face, his mouth. Despite the severe wounds on his body, the baby continued to strike the striped predator again, and he could do nothing but roar in pain. The animal's heart finally stopped, and exhaling its last breath, it finally fell into the cold snow-covered ground, pressing the boy. Little Mui's eyes slowly closed, his body no longer able to maintain consciousness. His face was cracked with his own and other people's blood. He thought to himself that this was the end and wondered why suddenly the weapon became so heavy. With these thoughts, his hand went limp, releasing the bloody knife into the snow. He swore at himself, upset because he really wanted to live a long life. Through Mui's mind, memories of how he wandered the streets from early childhood flew by, and to be honest, these are his first memories, so he doesn't know who exactly his parents are. He continues to remember how he had to survive by eating other people's leftovers, and when he begged in the villages, local children threw stones at him. In order to somehow suppress the constant hunger, he constantly slept. His bed was grass, but the locals set it on fire, saying that he was a source of infection and he should not stay near the village for a long time. He remembers the men he met when at the age of 6 they told him they would give him food and a roof over his head if he would be bait for traps intended to hunt wild animals. And he agreed because he was tired of constant arson and burning. The people called him Mui, which means plantain or wild grass. This was the name carved on the stone that hung around his neck. Dispelling the memories, the guy for a moment returned to reality, where he lies on the cold snow, bloodied, and with thoughts asking himself that he will really die like this. Among all this white picture, a patch of grass devoid of snow stood out as a bright green speck. 5 human figures standing on it looked from the height of this mountain at the forest and discussed the boy. Someone said that he felt sorry for him, and someone said that there was nothing to feel sorry for him because of him many cubs died. 5 old men with long gray hair were dressed in identical light-colored clothes that stretched to the ground. One of them, folding his arms on his chest, asked how many tigers of this mountain he had killed. Another old man standing next to him replied that the yellow and Tibetan baby, he thinks that there were more than 20 victims. Then the man holding his hands on his chest said that he still felt sorry for the boy, and since he appeared in these mountains he liked to watch him. Then he returned to the others and asked if the white tiger had also been killed. The old man next to him put his hand on his beard and also wondered why he didn't move. The other white-robed men suddenly became alarmed. The first grandfather, with a completely calm expression, invited them to check. The men, continuing to stand with their hands behind their backs, only slightly turned their heads towards the speaker and nodded affirmatively. A moment later, the 5 figures disappeared into a black shadow, leaving behind dust raised from the ground of the green hill. The soft western one descended onto the winter forest, deceiving with its cold warmth without paying attention. 2 bodies still lay in the snow. Heavy, a dead tiger, and under it a little boy. Suddenly they were no longer themselves. They were joined by the same memory figures that appeared just as they disappeared, trouble appearing in the middle of the forest. As soon as they materialized, one of the men approached the former rivals and stood on one knee in front of them, examining the small body. He exclaimed in a tone that conveyed the fate of admiration. He said that the more he watched him, the more interesting and mysterious he seemed, and he told the men to look at this boy who was still alive. The man with folded hands on his chest asked who he meant by thinking about the tiger, but he objected, saying that he was talking about the guy and that he had killed the tiger with a spear and a dagger. But then he added that the child also had little left, who asked how long he could hold out. The old man sitting next to the body with a heavy gaze replied that it would not be long. The other 4 standing nearby were silently thinking about something, looking at the bloody figures in front of them. The bald old man said that the boy, of course, is very stubborn and living, but his rank will eventually catch up with death. The third elder said about the guy that the madman who longed to live, and no matter what dangerous business he took on, always survived. Suddenly the main character of their discussions faintly showed signs of life, as if reminding him that he was still alive, had not died, and thus was not joke surprising them. The man sitting next to him returned to his partners and excitedly asked them what they would do, because this time the guy couldn't cope. The gray-haired figures only tilted their heads with tension and pondered the question that was asked of them. Finally, one of the men said that they shouldn't do anything but just leave him there, and reminded them that they shouldn't touch the man. Another elder, who turned his back to him, agreed, saying what his fate meant. The man with gray hair continued to sit next to the wounded man, and after these words, he looked excitedly at the distracted old man. Continuing to look with regret at the dying guy, he leaned his hands on his legs and began to rise heavily. Little Mui could not move, exhausted from the battle and wounds. He lay under the heavy carcass of the tiger. His eyelids finally closed and a tear flowed from the corner of his eye. The cold sun quickly disappeared behind the horizon, leaving behind a soft red light. It began to get dark in the forest. As soon as the sun disappeared, it was replaced by a round moon which illuminated the white tops of the branches with its moral radiance. Even after a day had passed, the 2 figures in the snow did not change their position, remaining in place while the crimson drops of blood slowly dusted the snow near them. Little Mui, unable to maintain his consciousness any longer, lay motionless. His entire white face, covered with old scars, was smeared with red liquid. Finally, the kings of the night forest began to slowly emerge from the darkness of the night. For wolves felt the coveted metallic aroma. The animals' eyes glowed with a yellow predatory glow, and steam came out of their noses. 2 more brothers were added to them, and now the boy and the demonic tiger were surrounded by hungry predators. One wolf approached the guy's body, and unable to withstand this temptation, grabs his cold hand with his teeth, tasting it. But a man's voice prevents them from enjoying their meal. It was the same old man with gray hair who had looked pitifully at the baby earlier. He turned to the animals, scolding them for the fact that there was something to eat in this little body. Frightened by the stranger, they left their find and turned around and ran away. The husband approached Muya, looking at the height of his height. The man crouched down, leaning towards him, then reaching out with his right hand to check. The old man's eyes widened in surprise, and his thick gray eyebrows rose, leaving even more wrinkles on his elderly face. He was surprised as soon as he realized that the guy was still breathing, and it was thanks to the tiger that he did not freeze to death. His attention was drawn to a small stone on a string hanging from the guy's neck. He reached over, picking it up to get a better look. The name of the young man, Mui, was carved on a colored stone. Suddenly he was distracted by the sound of a guy escaping from his throat. Blood began to flow out of a small hole in his neck. Seeing this, the man seemed to turn to Muya with the question of what comes out of the blood that he has already shed is still enough. He put 2 fingers of his right hand together and pointed them at the guy's body. His hand began to glow blue, and bright flashes emanating from the wounded man's body also glowed. The old man carefully put one hand under the guy's neck, clasping his shoulders. He picked Mui up in his arms, and looking at his bloody face, he said that he would give him his own life because there was little good in him. He would even say that his life was shameful, but let him not be disdainful and accept him. The black sky from which snowflakes fell onto the winter forest was covered with a scattering of stars that were brightly receding against a black background. In the depths of the night forest, surrounded by trees covered with a cold blanket, there stood a small hut from a small window of which warm light leaked. Mui was lying on a wooden table. His outerwear to the waist disappeared, revealing his wounded body. 3 claw scars ran across his chest, and there were 2 deep holes on his neck and under his collarbone. An old man sitting on a chair next to him covered the boy's body. He sadly noticed that the body was covered in wounds. He put his hand on the guy's chest and told him to live this life for himself. He stood next to the body of the wounded man, holding his palms over him, from which a soft bluish glow was emanating. He said, addressing the unconscious, giving his life because he is as unhappy as a man, and therefore let a long and happy life float for both of them. This lyrical moment was interrupted by a loud, rude voice which called the old man a madman and ridiculed his words about a happy life. The husband returned from surprise. Behind him on the bench sat 4 people with whom he had been in the forest. One of them in light clothes burst out at him, asking if his husband was in his right mind. The old man addressed him, calling him hen. The man in light clothes continued to quarrel, asking him if he understood what he was doing, and didn't he know what would happen to him if he helped him. He would just die. The old man with gray upset hair lowered his eyes, turning away, and replied that even if it was like that, he still wanted to save him. But he did not stop his indignation. Now he got up from the bench and asked his husband what happened now to everything that they had painstakingly created for 300 years. He advanced, asking whether he was going to destroy all this. But the man with gray hair replied that he was not worthy to be called a prophet. Another prophet continued to shout that even if the camper saved the boy now, he would still suffer a painful death later. The old man must leave this, after all, small for this world, only a curse. But the gray-haired one objected, saying that he would seal his energy for thousands of deaths. His opponent continued to shout as if he was going to do this because the energy of 1,000 deaths is a gift from heaven and is beyond his strength, so he must stop carrying the treasury and come to his senses, because this boy has already taken many lives, because everything what is left for him is that they have finally left this world, and therefore the old man is not wasting his strength in vain. The gray-haired man listened silently and continued to look with a heavy gaze at the guy lying on the table in front of him. He turned to his hen, saying that he was very sorry, but he seemed to have no right to be a prophet. His hen shouts, who among them has such a right here? Who of them has not sinned like him who has not killed? The old man in light clothes finally lost his composure. He shouts that he also killed 200 people, so what? All of them have repented tirelessly for 300 years. The guy's body, which had not been disturbed before, lay on the wooden surface, making strangled sounds. With panic in his voice, he said that he began to choke. He ignored the other man's words, turning to face the boy. Blue light flowed from his palms again. He apologized to his hen, explaining that he wanted to save this child, who had been the only solace in his eyes lately. The elder watched the other man tensely bending over Mui's body. Through his teeth, he muttered an insult to him, calling him a fool. Suddenly another man dressed in a pink robe rose from the bench. He stopped their quarrel by saying that this was enough. He approached them, saying that he would help the old man, and he could not allow him to leave this world alone. The man in light clothes widened his eyes in surprise, turning to him, calling him the King of Chaos, and asking if he was there, but he humbly replied that he too could not be a vice. After that, others rose from their seats and joined them, explaining that they also could not watch how this child lunged. The elder could not understand why they were doing this. They turned to him with the words that they had repented for a long time, all these centuries, but asked Hen to remember that they had committed a mortal sin. And each of them was very guilty, and wanting to become a vice is too much. And be that as it may this boy live a long life, even if he is unhappy, but this is the best they can do to repent. Their hen did not calm down, trying to convince them that they do not understand that the guy will become the greatest sinner and will surpass them all in the number of lives taken, but they still want to save him despite this. One of the men said that he would try to seal his energy, but Hen shouted that there was no such force that would allow him to do this. With all his strength, he can only hold it back for some time, but one day when the boy is not ready for this, it will break out, and therefore even if they save him, he will not be able to cope with their power, and not even 10 years will pass. She will destroy him. But the men no longer listened to him. They stood around the guy and stretching out their arms illuminated him with a radiance. One of them explained that 2 deaths cannot happen and 1 cannot pass, so they will hope that luck will smile on this child. Hen responded to this by simply calling them crazy. The boy's body was completely enveloped by the blue light that the prophets sent to him. This radiance filled the entire space of the house, in the corner of which the oldest man stood and watched their actions with condemnation. He changed his face and twitched about himself, thinking that he had lived 1,000 years without them, but still joined them, telling them to move and bring cold water for the guy. The cold water of a mountain river flowed like a waterfall into a small pond, making murmurs and wet splashes all around. Greenery was everywhere. At the top of the mountain there was a valley that remained detached from the snowy shell of winter. Lost among the trees stood a wooden hut from which someone's voice addressed the old people. In the middle of the wooden building sat 5 old men with long gray hair. And in front of them is a small black-haired boy. They looked irritated at such rude treatment. The man with gray hair asked if he was awake. The man with gray hair told the boy that if he were him, he would speak with more respect to his saviors. The boy looked at the man in surprise and repeated the last word with a question. Suddenly memories of recent events flashed through his head like a kaleidoscope. Images of an angry tiger appeared before him, as well as his own blood and wound. After the last one, he immediately grabbed his shoulder, which was damaged during the fight with the beast. He was surprised that his wounds had already healed. As if he remembered something, he asked his offender, the demonic tiger. One of the old men rose from the bench in front of the guy and, placing his hands on his legs, explained to Muya that he had killed him. A man with gray eyes asked the boy if he had a name. The black-haired man with a serious look answered the old man that his name was Mui. The husband said that Mui is a good name, so let yours be the same and live happily. The boy sitting on the bed listened carefully to the stranger. After such a short conversation, the men with gray hair walked out in line, leaving the guy looking after them. The man with gray hair, who was most worried about the guy, wondered if they really managed to seal the deadly energy of this child. Meanwhile, this child looked at the continuing retreating figures and wondered who these old people were and why they lived on the top of the mountain. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud grunt coming from the baby's stomach. His mask of wariness immediately fell, and he grabbed his stomach with his hand. When he went outside, he inquisitively examined the riot of greenery that was seething around, and this did not at all match the frosty snow on which he was last conscious. He wondered how long it had been. He continued to look around in surprise at the green leaves and grass, wondering if he had slept for so long. Suddenly a wild rabbit jumped out in front of him and quickly ran past. Mui immediately reacted, looking at him. The rabbit picked up speed, moving away from the young hunter. Mui, frowning his eyebrows, shouted back in the trail. Without waiting long, he rushed as fast as an animal pushing off the ground with his boots. But unexpectedly, instead of just running, his feet left the ground, lifting him into the air. The Dark One widened his eyes in surprise, just like his prey, who only managed to raise his small eyes at the strange flying man. He continued to fly, and when he was above the rabbit, he lowered his head down, looking at him with incomprehension. On this way, their paths missed each other. The gray-furred creature rushed to the side as Mui flew over it and flew straight into the bushes. The green leaves where the boy flew remained unshakable for a moment, covering the small figure. Mui stood up sharply and looked out of the bushes. He raised one eyebrow and sat with his mouth open. He could not come to his senses without understanding how it happened and how it happened. He stood rubbing his head. He was trying to put everything together, and that he just took one step and took off. He shook himself off and then began to jump alternately on one leg, then on the other, wondering if he should try this again. He bent his knees and crouched down, resolutely preparing to jump. As soon as he left the ground, he quickly rose up, and this time even higher. From afar, above the tops of the green trees, a small dark figure could be seen looking around in confusion. Beads of sweat appeared on Mui's face, and he himself hovered in the air with a confused expression, waving his arms. The guy's body began to quickly fall down to the ground, and he screamed, spreading his arms. He landed roughly among the fluffy trees, disturbing the local harmony. Just like last time, he jumped out of the bushes with the same funny, confused expression on his face. But this expression quickly gave way to a sly smile and a short laugh. He said he liked it. The boy quickly found a use for his new abilities. He ran in a race with the rabbit whose eyes widened in fear, and with the help of his powerful jumps, he rose into the air and caught flying birds. With one strong blow, he went at a healthy black boar with the most innocent smile on his lips. He walked along a green road on both sides of which green and purple trees grew. With one hand he pulled the carcass of a difficult animal behind him. The blue sky was covered with thick gray clouds. The sky erupted with bright lightning causing powerful thunder. Mui stood in the middle of the bare sky and the rushing rain quickly wet his hair and clothes. His face was no longer serene but instead turned red from tension. He moved his feet heavily on the wet grass, holding his stomach with his right hand. As soon as he climbed the green hill, he immediately exercised on his knees, bending over in pain. Despite the obstacles, he continued plasma climbing the stone mountain. At the top of the hill, there were huge boulders that were folded into a simple structure, forming a cave between them. In the middle of it, on stone ledges, sat 5 old figures who, with their hands folded on their knees, looked expectantly at the entrance to the cave. The man with gray hair calmly closed his eyes as if he knew what awaited them now. A hysterical boyish voice was heard through the cave asking what they had done with his body. The man, having waited for his guest, raised his heavy eyelids. The figure of a black-haired boy appeared in the stone passage, supporting his position by holding onto the cold wall with his fingers while the other continued to clutch his stomach. He raised his reddened face to the old men and asked them sharply what they had done to him. The gray-haired man looked at him and asked the boy why he was so noisy. Mui replied with irritation that he was in pain and was about to die. He continued to breathe heavily, looking from under his forehead at the people in front of him. The old man was in front of the boy in an instant, ordering him that even if he was in pain he must endure. Darky looked at him in confusion, not understanding his train of thought. The old prophet began to quickly apply precision strikes to the guy's body, to which he furiously asked why they were still finishing off. But while the man continued his strange procedure, the guy was amazed to notice that the pain was gradually going away. The black cave stood out clearly against the background of smooth stone ledges. The storm didn't even think about subsiding. After completing such an unusual treatment, the guy sat on the earthy floor, leaning his hands behind him. The man standing next to him asked if he was okay. Mui turned his head towards the old man with irritation because he wanted to argue. The husband interrupted him, knocking down the guy's ardor, and said in a calm tone that he was in pain because 5 of them had transferred their power to him. The guy repeated the last word while asking. The man explained that it is inside him and is the energy that will protect him from internal and external dangers. And just as the body becomes stronger through training, their strength grows through noble deeds and human victories. He continued to explain to Mui that they needed to transfer their powers to him in order to prolong his life at least a little. But the guy just shouted with concern that he didn't need it and let them take him back. The old man explained with regret in his eyes that this was impossible. But the guy only excitedly asked why. The man replied that there was no reason and he needed to come to terms with it. The guy continued to ask in despair what to do now, but would he really have to endure this pain for the rest of his life? Clenching his hands into fists, he continued to persistently prove that he did not sign up for this and he did not need it, so let them take their power back. One of the men who sat further away and watched this scene said that they really should have left him to die, so let him now remember that everything in this world has its own attention and this pain is the price of this life. The boy's eyes took on a sad tint and his lips pursed. He held back the disappointment caused by the old man's words. The gray-haired man standing next to him affectionately explained that they would not be able to take away their power, but he could accept the pain a little. And then, after a short pause, he said that thanks to good deeds. The boy, not understanding anything, stared at the man with a silent question. He answered it as if reading thoughts that, with their help, he could take this power under control. Mui did not take his eyes off the man, and sparks flashed in his eyes. Thus began his new life. The guy remembers that he learned a lot. Mui's Dansoang has the claw method of Susho magic. In Hafo Gulma, strengthening different parts of the body. The king of chaos Huang Chongri has mastery over swordsmanship and smooth movements. Zhongdiak Megan gave him poisonous blood and the ability to regenerate. But Jason taught him perseverance and stubbornness. He trained day and night because the pain still did not want to subside. It continued to attack, forcing the body to fight in agony. Therefore he meditated a lot and poured out all his energy during sword training, which reduced the attacks. But even after 5 years of stubborn training with old men who became weaker day by day, he never learned to fully control the power received from them. During this time, he matured noticeably. His facial features became sharper and his black hair grew longer. He turned to his mentors with concern. The natural silence was broken by a loud sound accompanied by a curtain of dust. Large, smooth stones which previously formed a cave with a roar fell down, destroying it. Mui stood looking at what used to be his home and remembered the words of his old mentors. They explained to him that their time had come, but he shouldn't be too sad having already left him like this. They would cause each other less pain than if they said goodbye face to face. They admitted to him that, frankly speaking, over the last 300 years of their lives, only the memories of those years that they spent with him could be called pleasant. Finally, they asked that they not use their power only to protect themselves and loved ones and not for senseless killings. And even if he ever accidentally uses too much power under the influence of emotions, there is a chance that he will not only experience unbearable pain but also lose his memory. They apologized to the young man for the fact that they were never able to deprive him of pain, and therefore may there always be more happiness in his life than theirs had. They asked him to remember that he only had 10 years to live, but if he could find the guardians of Muramu, then everything would change. The mentors said that they were not omnipotent, but they might be able to take away his pain and give him a long life. And at the end, the old people asked him to try to live a long and happy life. Having seen off the old prophets on their final journey, Mui wiped away the remnants of his grief, which had left a wet mark on his cheeks. He proudly raised his head to the sky and, as if addressing his mentors, mentally thanked them, promising that he would try. He rose from his knees and now stood confidently with both feet on this ground in front of the last refuge of the men. Finally, he knelt down once more, bowing as a sign of gratitude and respect for his masters. The small wooden house, which had once belonged to the prophets, continued to stand alone between the trees. Someone's hand carefully pulled out a jagged stone with a chipped edge from the cabinet. A strange man with long black hair was carefully examining someone else's thing, the only inheritance that Mui received from his previous life. An inheritance that bore his name. The door to the house opened with a creak. Mui entered the room. He immediately noticed a strange stranger rummaging through his things. He got into a fighting stance, loudly asking the man who was sitting calmly on the bed who he was. The stranger had eyes as black as coal and unruly thick hair. He did not answer, but was only glad that Mui had finally come. The guy looked at the stranger warily, wondering if he could be a new hunter. They continued to silently look at each other, and so the man raised his hand in which he held the young man's pendant and asked if this fireplace amulet belonged to him. Mui, with irritation, sharply tore his thing out of the hands of the stranger and asked why he was rummaging through other people's things. The man did not answer, and only a slight shadow of a satisfied smile touched his lips. He reached his hand to the inside of his clothes near his chest, looking for something there. Having found it, the man pulled out the same pendant that was hanging around his neck. The man explained that it was called the Soul Stone. He gave it to his mother to perform long before the guy was born. Mui did not expect such details and therefore only opened his mouth in bewilderment, mentally clinging to the last word. The man began to explain that if you split a stone in two, it will always try to reunite with its other half, and in this way you can find the person with whom you have lost contact. The young man looked at the amulet that the strange stranger had given him and compared it with his own. He once again repeated the phrase that these stones used to be one whole. Breaking him out of his thoughts, the man suddenly asked Mui for forgiveness. He stood opposite him, putting his hand back on his shoulder, and said that he did not know about his birth, because if he had known he would have come much sooner, and therefore he asks for forgiveness. The guy looked at the man in front of him, and a barely noticeable blush appeared on his cheeks. He began to come to conclusions. The elder asked him if he had a name. The guy briefly answered that Mui. Then the husband asked if his mother called him that, but he only said that he didn't know, but that's what was written on the amulet, and that's why people called him that. A man with sadness in his eyes, I looked at the guy in front of me, feeling sorry for him. He thought that he had probably suffered and experienced a lot when he lost his mother as a child. He told Mui that his last name was Tongfang and his father's name was Gajjun. The guy's eyes lit up with new information about his father. He immediately thought in his mind that his father's name was Tunfan Gajjun and his own name was Tunfan Mui. The man with a smile asked Mui what he had been doing all this time, to which he replied that he was bait. The husband asked again, and the guy explained that he was bait for tigers and wolves. From what they heard, the men's eyes immediately filled with pain and pity for the guy. But he continued to calmly look at this in response, and only strokes of blush showed his inner emotions. Suddenly, the man grabbed the young man's body with both hands, pulling him into a hug. The red tint on Mui's cheeks became more intense, and he immediately began to search for the nature of the strange feelings. The husband moved away from him, offering to go with him, remembering some place where he himself had not been for a long time. Mui only cautiously asked if they were going home. A young girl was running past the green trees and along the grass. Her hair was pulled back with a red pin. She held a weapon in her right hand and, despite moving forward, looked behind her. Behind her rushed a group of pursuers which consisted of 5 figures in black clothes, and their faces were hidden by masks. She turned away from them, continuing to run further away in an attempt to break away. But armed masked men quickly caught up with them, increasing their pace. They continued their 5-on-1 competition. The girl managed to run away from them, but they did not lag behind. On the table lined with a white tablecloth, there were packages of hot dishes which, along with the steam, spread an appetizing aroma. Gajjun asked his son if he wanted to eat. Mui, who was caught contemplating the hot buns, stopped, his eyes widening. He stood with his back to the man, and thanks to this, he could not see the shy blush on his cheeks. He rubbed the back of his head. The man behind the counter congratulated 2 passers-by and asked them if they wanted to buy some mandu. The older brunette replied with a soft smile that he had no money now, to which the seller handed him over with the words that he should go to another place. Instead, the man pulled out his sword in front of the mustachioed cook, hidden in a black knife with gold trim at the ends. Yusni's eyes widened in shock. The elder Tongfan asked him to give them some food in exchange for this sword, to which the seller immediately removed his emotions and said incredulously that he should try it somewhere else. But the brunette continued, saying that if he sells it, then the money will be enough to pay for a new tent made of manda. At these words, the mustachioed salesman looked at the man, narrowing his eyes slyly. He took the scabbard in his hands, half drawing the sword out of it. He examined the blade and meticulously said that no one would buy a sword with so many jagged edges. He called another man from a nearby stall, asking him to come over for a moment. Chan looked up from his work and approached and asked why. The mustachioed seller said that, as he said, he used to deal with swords, and asked to look at it. Chan critically examined the weapons, and when asked whether they could be sold, he replied that it was possible, but not as a sword but as metal. The black-haired man laughed in surprise that the sword created by the masters Okol and I Hyun was rated so low, but then said that it did not matter and asked to give them their mandu. The young man stood silently all this time, raised his hand and tugged at the older man's sleeve. He returned with surprise, looking at the young man in front of him. The elder just laughed, saying that everything was fine and he didn't need the sword anymore. They returned with a fabric you full of fragrant pussy. Gajjun asked the guy who was carrying the knapsack why he wasn't eating, because if they cooled down they wouldn't be as tasty anymore, so he should eat them quickly. Mui pulled out 1 pie from the bag with a smile. As soon as he took a bite, a slight pink blush appeared on his face and his eyes sparkled with pleasure. The husband asked the young man if something was wrong. He, continuing to chew with a joyful expression on his face, replied that everything was wrong. And then he immediately stuffed the remaining piece into his mouth, closing his eyes from the gastronomic pleasure. The elder smiled at the guy and said that as soon as they arrived they could rest. With a barely sad expression on his face, the man asked the guy holding the bitten pie how he even ate it. The young man remained silent, bowing his head guiltily. The elder put the pie with the others laid out on the stone, and said that most likely they were given what was not sold the day before. To change the subject, Mui exclaimed joyfully, remembering the water. He turned towards the reservoir that had flooded the valley and rushed away, leaving the man alone. He cheerfully watched the boy, smiling happily. In his hands, Mui held a homemade bowl made from some thick leaves and leaned towards the source to draw water. But strange red stains in the transparent liquid attracted his attention. He looked up and looked, running, asking where the blood came from. The gaze of his black eyes seemed to be caught on something. He turned his attention to it. On a stone island that looked out of the water lay a girl in purple clothes. It was Suyang. She was unconscious, and blood trails flowed down the stone surface from her into the water. Their hair had fallen out of their hairstyle and was now falling onto their grimy face. There was a deep cut on their hand. All their clothes were dirty with dust and blood. Gajjun brought the leaf cup to his mouth and silently drank the fresh water. While he finished his drink, Muan looked at him expectantly with his hands folded behind his back. A satisfied smile appeared on the elder's face, and turning to the guy, he exhaled, saying that it was very refreshing. From such an insignificant comment, the guy's eyes shone and a happy smile appeared on his face. Their idol benefits 5 armed men in black masks until recently Sangu. They were approaching the men. One of them asked if they had seen a wounded girl here. The older man looked at the younger man with a soft smile and a look of reassurance with his confidence. One of the pursuers widened his eyes, horribly recognizing him as the Emperor of Death. Suddenly, a third party joined them, causing everyone present to turn their heads towards its source. Someone's voice loudly shouted to the men in black that she was here. The man in black, whose braid was falling over his face fearfully, and with an air of obedience apologized for them to the emperor. Pushing off from the ground, he moves away from them in one leap, leaving them to follow him with their gaze. Gajjun asked Muan if he had seen that girl. The guy nodded affirmatively with a hint of guilt. 2 black ants with shiny shells pierced the white soft larva, dragging them away for food. One of the men in black came out of the water, and on his shoulder was the body of a girl, which he supported with one hand. The rest of the men were waiting for him on land. After they had the girl they needed, they moved away from the pond and walked in the direction of 2 Tunfans. The older brunette will return to the guy, saying that she probably lost consciousness, so why did he leave them there? The girl lying on the shoulder of the fighter in black opened her eyes slightly. She looked at the 2 men who stood aside and watched this picture. With just her lips, she barely audibly whispered her prayer for help. Gajjun reacted in surprise to this request, while the younger guy sheepishly continued to stand nearby, looking somewhere on the ground. Suddenly, the older man turned to the man in the black mask, calling him a blue dragon warrior, and asked him who this girl was. He looked fearfully at the man who addressed him. The warrior lowered his gaze intensely, and sweat appeared at the head of it. He considered what he should answer. In the end, he returned and then looked at the man and answered something to the daughter of Gwi Kyungsu. Gajjun seemed to immediately understand who he was talking about and asked if it was the same crazy Yale, to which the warrior answered in the affirmative. Then he continued his interrogation, asking why they needed her. The warrior lowered his gaze, answering that he could not say, and his husband was no longer part of the imperial family, so he could not tell him about either internal or external affairs. While they were talking, fighters with red hair and long knives in their hands quickly came at them from above. The blue dragon looked up in fear, and Gajjun only frowned his thick black eyebrows and pursed his lips. Muan, who had been silently standing nearby all this time, now looked up in surprise at the strange strangers. As soon as they landed, they immediately surrounded everyone present in a circle. They had masks on their faces, and the same red symbol was repeated on their armor. They shouted, and the girl was given to them. The warrior looked around in fear and panic, looking at the new arrivals. Suddenly his eyes widened in amazement and fear. Before him stood an old man with dark skin and gray thick hair. His eyes sparkled with the same gold from which his clothes were made. He stood majestically above everyone, holding a sword in his hand. It was the Dark Reaper Ujimni. The Dark Reaper continued to scan everyone with his bright eyes, and on his head was a golden crown. The blue warrior watched him excitedly and mentally cursed, realizing that this was bad and not understanding why he was here. His attention turned back to the former emperor, who had been standing motionless the entire time, and then he began to put everything together. Breaking his silence, Gajjun ordered the soldiers to bring the girl to him. All the dragons looked at the man in fear. The warrior with a braid falling down his face looked intensely in the direction where the Dark Reaper was. He looked sternly with his golden eyes. The warriors continued to stand in front of the new arrivals with swords in their hands, while the one who had it on his shoulders, Yale, carried it to the emperor. He carefully placed her on the ground at his feet. Gajjun sat down, leaning towards the girl, and asked her name. She whispered Shin Suyang's name in a weak voice. Then the elder Toffman placed his rough hand on her wounded shoulder, and a faint blue glow began to emanate from his palm. Suddenly it turned into a bright stream of energy, reflecting light from Suyang's body. A moment later, as a result of the influence of this magical energy, the girl was finally able to fully open her eyes. She stood up a little, and the husband in front of her put his hand on her shoulder and asked her why she had angered Emperor Tor Muan so much. With tears in her eyes, the girl said that they killed her father and then babbled something about a gold mine. Having stopped at these words, Gajjun once again carefully asked about the gold mine. About himself, he remembered that this seems to be the place in the mountains where all the treasures of flying thieves are stored, and therefore it is understandable that the Dark Reaper Ugimni came to such wilds. Meanwhile, Ugimni had already spoken himself, asking who he was and whether he was really the Emperor of Death. The said emperor ignored this question, silently looking at him. Then the Reaper, with an unkind smile on his face, asked why the man who used to be Muan's dog was here. Gajjun, without interrupting the healing Shin Suyang, turned his head to him and replied that it was a simple coincidence, to which the Reaper laughed and told him not to make him laugh but to answer honestly, or is it because he was thrown away like some kind of garbage that no one else needs? Ugimni continued to mock the former Emperor of Death, saying that this was also not bad because otherwise he could now be lying in some ditch with his throat cut. Having completed the empty mockery, he put out his palm in front of him, from which an orange light was directed at Toffman, and ordered him to give the girl. Gajjun frowned even more, not reacting in any way to the Reaper's words, but only looking to the side. Out of nowhere, one more participant joined this whole Kagala. He flew in the air towards the valley where the people were standing. The elder Toffman looked around in alarm, looking at the stranger. The blue snake warrior looked at the newcomer in surprise, his eyes widening, while the Dark Reaper, although he did not expect this, did not show it. They all had one name in their minds: Muan the Flawless. The man whose name was Muan gracefully landed on the ground, his long brown hair blowing in the wind. His foot, in expensive shoes, carefully touched the hard surface. The blue dragon warriors bowed their heads, respectfully calling the man Overlord. Muan stood in front of Ugimni. The men looked at each other in silence, and each held his weapon in his hands. A stern look was visible in the eyes of the impeccable ruler, decorated with a fine web of wrinkles around him, while the Dark Reaper looked at him relaxed without removing his signature smile from his face. The armed men continued to look down at each other with heavy glances as their supporters watched silently. On one side stood Muan, and the warriors of the Blue Dragon stood armed with their swords. The husband broke eye contact, looking away from the gaze of golden predatory eyes, and turned his head in the other direction. He watched as Elder Tongfan poured his magical energy into the girl's body to heal it. He narrowed his eyes at himself, calling the black-haired man a madman. He still couldn't understand why he was sharing his energy with someone else in such a situation, and then again he called him a fool. He turned to Gajjun and said in a friendly tone that he felt uneasy when he left the palace. Gajjun didn't look at him. He continued to silently treat Suyang's wounds, and only something moved in the depths of his eyes. Muan repeated his attempt to talk to her husband, saying that his daughter was waiting for Dongfang, her husband, although he was apparently disappointed by the news about the child and Emperor Muriang. The old man said that he was very sorry that everything turned out this way and apologized, and also added that he always considered him his son-in-law. Hearing this, Ugimni, who was standing nearby, burst out laughing, saying that it was even funny to use his pretty daughter to appease his faithful dog before death. Turning to the Flawless One, he shouted that his games were enough of them, so let him show his true face, to which he glanced at Ugimni. And at this time the Dark Reaper contorted his face, blazing with contempt. Muan will return to his former warrior again with a request to forgive his daughter, saying that he has already scolded her and therefore invites Dongfan to return together. But Gajjun didn't pay attention to this. He put his hand on Suyang's shoulder and asked her if she could get up, saying that he had heard a lot about her pretty good abilities. The girl, who had already begun to come to her senses thanks to her husband's healing magic, now listened to him, a little confused. Without waiting for her answer, he asked if she knew who he was. The girl's eyebrows rose in amazement. With a serious look, he said that under Muan he was called the Emperor of Death. Sukyin immediately understood who the thing was about, remembering another name of her husband, who was also called the God of War. The husband in front of her said that he would help her and asked if he gave her the opportunity to avenge her father, what could she do for him? The girl, whose eyes were filled with tears, looked at her savior in surprise. He continued explaining that he would die anyway, but at least he could take several other people with him to the next world. But how would she repay him for this then? Suyang bowed her head, not allowing the tears to break through any further, and readily said that she was ready to do anything. Emotions had gotten the better of her and were now pouring out in salty trails down her cheeks, but she did not change her gaze, resolutely awaiting the man's next words. The elder Tunfan stood up and, continuing to speak to the girl, put his hand on the shoulder of the black-haired guy, saying that his name was Tunfan Mui and he was his son. The girl follows his movement, looking at the young man with the same coal-black eyes. Muan, who remained ignored, widened his eyes in surprise at the fact that the Emperor of Death had a son. The new father took his son by the shoulder and asked the girl to use all her skills to protect him. The boy in question looked at the rescued girl. Suyang looked at him and nodded decisively in response, confirming the agreement. The elder Tunfan turned to the younger and, squeezing his shoulder, turned to his son, explaining that no matter what happened, he remembered that he was his father and had always been and would be on him. Mui's eyes began to fill with tears. He silently looked at his father but mentally desperately asked his husband not to leave. His lips pursed to contain the inner despair caused by the man's words. He thought resentfully about his father, that all this was because of him. Suyang looked with regret at the guy's inner experiences. Gajjun raised his hand higher to his son's face and told him not to hold grudges and anger in his soul, but not to live like his father. Men's hands carefully touched the boy's cheeks, along which tears flowed. Gajjun told Mui not to get bored because the man knew that his end was near. He pulled his son to his chest, pulling him into his arms, and told the baby that his grandfather lives in Nyagan, so he must find him to be safe. The eldest moved away from Mui, holding his hand on his shoulder, and with a slight smile asked the guy to give his grandfather all the love that he could not give to his father. Without waiting for the boy's protest, Gajjun directed magical energy to the tips of his fingers. With precise movements, he pressed the corresponding points on the baby's body. Mui tensed, trying to understand why he suddenly couldn't move or speak. He thought with pain about the man whom he had never even managed to call dad. Gajjun turned his back to his son as he walked away from them and ordered him and the girl to leave. When he was far enough away, the Death Emperor was finally able to release his full power. His body was enveloped in energy, sparkling in his still black eyes with a blue radiance. Suyang ran up to the guy who froze in place and tightly grabbed him from behind with her arms, and the wind caused by the Emperor rose around them. Muan narrowed his eyes and sternly asked the man what he was going to do. The power of the glorious death god surged out of his body in a powerful wave. The man himself roared loudly, clenching his hands into fists, trying to maintain control over this force. The blue dragon warriors standing nearby closed their eyes and covered their ears, unable to withstand such a loud sound, and now unnecessary swords peeked out in their palms. Ujimni, who was still skinning defiantly, now wiped the smile from his face and watched the former Death Emperor with worry. Tunfan balanced his power, and now the energy waves did not rise in a menacing storm but calmly flew around him. He returned to his former father-in-law, saying that he really loved his daughter, believed that these feelings were mutual, or rather he knew that this was not so, but he still turned a blind eye to it. Hanging his head sadly, he said that he himself had committed stupid things, and also knew that sooner or later this day would come, and then he called himself a fool in love who was even ready to die in the name of love. The old man he was addressing tried to argue with words so that Gajjun would come to his senses, because his daughter still loves him, and if he returns then everything will be fine. He was interrupted by the voice of his former son-in-law. The black-haired man raised his eyebrows on the bridge of his nose, asking the old man if he knew what he swore to himself every time he cut off the heads of the old man's enemies. He swore that one day he would give up everything and leave. His black eyes again began to be filled with blue pressure, and the man with metal in his voice continued that he also swore that he would cut his throat back with his own hands. After his phrase, a bluish light replaced his dark iris, and black hair rose up from the energy field around the Emperor. With his entire body he radiated this power, for which he was nicknamed the God of Death. Muan also lit up with rage, and his body was covered in purple mist. He looked at his former son-in-law, asking how dare he. On the other hand, illuminated by the same gold as his eyes with armor, stood Ujimni holding a ready sword. The men who had recently been throwing mud at each other looked at each other. They seemed to talk in complete silence until they reached a silent agreement. The Death Emperor took on a dangerous look and ordered the children behind him to run away immediately. Those whom Gajjun addressed looked at him in surprise with worry in their hearts. Mui could only move his head but was unable to do anything else. The girl holding him by the shoulders with sadness in her eyes looked back for the last time at her savior, who was preparing for a mortal battle. She did not stay longer and, obeying the ruler's order, got off the ground. Suyang quickly moved away from the hard surface where the warriors remained standing, and with her was Mui, who did not even have time to react. Someone from the earth ordered to catch them. Behind them the Dark Reaper's men jumped from the ground holding their swords in their hands. But their pursuit plan failed. The god of death began his work again, and with one wave of his hand turned it into ashes. One of the blue dragon warriors looked at the picture in horror. One of the representatives of Ujimni's army, a man with red hair, watched as his companions were scattered by the wind. The Dark Reaper himself did not wait long, with his eyes also flooded with light, and rushed at the emperor. Together with him Muan entered the game, near whom violet energy flew, spreading in crooked waves. They all attacked Gajjun together. 3 of the region's strongest fighters clashed in a frenzied battle to the death. Black-haired Tongfang clenched his teeth and swung his right fist covered in bluish light. The Dark Reaper approached the man and together with Muan struck Gajjun. Flawless meanwhile carried out a wide assassination attempt with his enhanced blade. Somewhere high in the sky Suyang and Mui were flying. The girl looked straight ahead, obediently following the order of the older man, and at that time the guy watched as a huge explosion occurred in the forest from which he was taken. Fear mixed with excitement for his father flashed before the guy's eyes. The man continued to steadfastly fight off the huge number of enemies rushing at him at the same time. Suddenly Ujimni approached him and hit his husband in the head with all his might with his knee. Gajjun managed to soften the blow with his hands only at the last moment. Taking advantage of this pause, the former father-in-law quickly approached and mercilessly slashed at the former subject with his sword, leaving bloody splashes behind. After that, the man continued to miss blow after blow, and thick blood flowed from his face and body. This beating was observed by large dark eyes, which from rage began to be called blood. The guy began to blush as during his attacks inflated veins stood out on his face under the skin. He screamed in his head to let him go because he had to come back. The young man tensed his whole body. He roared loudly and the air began to thicken around him. The girl looked around in fear, having shaken off her stupor. She couldn't understand that he could really quit on his own. The guy continued to scream while Suyang approached the ground, not letting go of his hands. As soon as their feet touched the hard surface, the guy coughed up blood. She walked up to him and gently touched his shoulder and asked if he was okay. He abruptly threw her hand away and furiously shouted at her to move away and not dare to touch him. Muck clenched his teeth and looked at his hijacker. There were dark red spots on his face and clothes, but it did not interfere with the blood or the pain that had just passed through the body. He only presses on his father's sword. The guy's aura began to change rapidly. He remembered the Mandu tent. A man with a thin long mustache was now rapidly flying somewhere to the side, spitting out his own blood copiously. His attacker was a black-haired young man who just recently, with eyes full of childish joy, had been buying pussy from him. A guy with eyes slowly filling with a reddish glow shouted at him for the man to turn his father's sword. The mustache looked at the guy in bewilderment with surprise and fear. Red streaks ran down his nose from his nose. But the young man, blinded by anger, did not pay attention to the man's fear of him. He only ordered him to speed up. The seller carefully shifted the sword into the black knives of the guy who with a sharp movement tore it out of his hands. Mui no longer resembles his former self. Now, like some cruel thief, he looked at the man and with his left hand, he slightly pulled out the sword which glinted in the sun. The seller's face became red from the young man's blow, and he weakly stammered, asking to be spared. The guy's eyebrows barely furrowed. He no longer paid attention to the man with a sharp movement, hiding the metal one a little back in the anklet. He quickly turned around in one powerful leap and took off from the ground. The girl who had been watching his actions all this time only managed to wave her hands. Suyang looked at him with her eyebrows raised in surprise and asked herself in surprise, what was that, just a flying technique? Without waiting any longer, she repeated his actions, resolutely deciding to herself that she needed to follow him. The unfortunate Mandu seller remained sitting with his back against the counter and looked after the strange children. When they were far enough away from the market, his face relaxed and sighed with relief. The dark-clothed man's knees hit the hard ground. Everything around him, including his clothes and the ground, were stained with dark stains. The Emperor of Death lay helplessly on the ground, head down, and the purple and golden figures stood above him, and the latter triumphantly placed her foot on her husband's back. Ujimni pushed the feline emperor forcefully onto the hard surface. The god of death continued to lie helplessly with his eyes closed. The flawless one's face was covered with sweat and blood flowed from his mouth, which he wiped with his hand. He noticed that Gajjun was very strong and later added that he was. The Dark Reaper thought hard that if he had not united with Emperor Muan, He did not think that he would have been able to withstand Gajjun. Suddenly, an unexpected loud sound attracted Muan's attention, and he immediately turned towards the sound from there. At breakneck speed, the figure of a boy was approaching them holding a sword raised above his head. His blade glowed with a dazzling blue light which with its power scattered all enemies in front of him. The black-haired young man stood at the fighting post and cut the warrior in front of him with one blow. Even though his sword had the color of a clear sky, there was a fire burning in his eyes. He roared loudly for everyone to get out of the way. The guy continued to mercilessly cut down the people in front of him with his sword, causing a bloody rain around him. He raised his eyebrows on the bridge of his nose and turned to his father and rushed towards him. Warriors with red hair appeared in front of him trying to stop the guy, but he easily continued to clear his way. His gaze flashed like a hot iron, and he did not hesitate to deal with his enemies. The Dark Reaper froze in place with widened eyes. He was shocked that this little guy could take out the best warriors with just one swing of his sword. The young man had already approached the place where the strongest stood and the bloody body of his father lay before their feet. He shouted at them to get out. Something clicked in the men's heads, and like a team they simultaneously jumped away from the young man, who immediately appeared in front of them. As soon as Muk sat down in front of his husband, his entire warlike aura disappeared, and with a look full of excitement and anxiety, he carefully touched his husband's body, calling him Dad. He shook him and screamed for him to wake up. Among the complete darkness that filled the consciousness of the wounded man, the tear-stained face of his son appeared, looking at him with hope. But unable to even keep his eyes open anymore, his eyes filled with darkness again, and the image in front of him became blurry. The last glimmers of light disappeared, taking with them the face of a loved one. And the husband mentally turned to his son, saying that he loved him and asked for forgiveness. Mui's world has changed again. With tears in his eyes, he screamed protractedly, splashing out his grief. Suyang finally caught up with the guy. Her brows furrowed as she looked at another child who had lost his father. The loud sound echoed through the forest like a powerful wave, frightening the birds hiding in the leaves of neighboring trees. The young man interrupted his grief to begin his bloody dance again. His eyes glowed red as he screamed at the men standing in the distance that he would destroy them all. Ugimni, whose face was dripping with a thin stream of blood, left him standing rooted to the spot, and Muan watched in fear as the son of the god of death rushed through their soul. They simultaneously thought that the guy was dangerous. The old man's eyes suddenly glowed purple, and he gripped the hilt of his sword tighter, preparing to strike. The young man with the eyes of red-hot iron had already swung away his weapon, which at the same time was the only legacy of his father. The old man planted his feet firmly on the ground, holding his sword out in front of him, and Mui flew at him from above, striking him. Their weapons hit each other with a resounding clang, and bright sparks rained down from them. Unable to withstand this blow, the guy was thrown back by a powerful wave. Muan looked after him with displeasure, squinting because of the raised wave of dust. Suddenly, Flawless' face changed into shock, and he stared wide-eyed at the guy in front of him. Even though the shock wave initially blew him away, Mui was able to hold on, and was now firmly planted with his feet on the ground, holding on with his sword. Looking at the guy with his blazing red eyes, the man thought what kind of power this was and where he got such power from. Black-haired Tunfan jumped out of his seat and ran straight towards the man. Muan swung his purple blade, but the boy had already realized his mistake, so he ducked and slid under it, avoiding the fatal blow. Flawless widened his eyes and looked down with his mouth open. The son of the Emperor of Death performed his trick and approached his opponent with another blow. He swung and cut the blue-filled blade through the air. Muan's sword met the guy's sword, scattering bright sparks around. This did not stop the young man. He looked at his opponent from under his forehead and clenched his teeth in a barely suppressed outburst of anger. There were blue flashes around him caused by the swings of the sword. Bright splashes of light flew around the old man's face. He couldn't keep up with the baby's unexpectedly animated movements. Muk moved skillfully, firmly holding the gilded hilts of his father's sword. He struck the man's weapon without breaking eye contact. Meanwhile, Muan, taking advantage of the inexperienced Dongfan's uncontrollable anger, hit him with the purple energy that he had prematurely collected in his left hand. Sukyin, who could only watch this fierce battle from afar, was frightened when she saw the guy miss a blow. Mui was blown away by a powerful blow from the Flawless one. He rolled across the ground, raising dust from it. He landed on his stomach, his sword hand in front of him. The sharp end of the man's sword was staring into his face. Muan now stood over the guy, warningly pointing a weapon at him, and asked who taught him all this, and said that he could leave it in memory of his father, but all this power of his would become a big problem in the future. Looking into the face of the angry guy, he said that he prefers to tear off the shoots of future troubles by the roots. Suyang could no longer stand aside. The game rushed off to help the young man. Muan looked at her with an indifferent expression. The girl raised her eyebrows and looked tensely in front of her. She quickly approached to help the guy. Muan glanced displeasedly in her direction, noticing the movement behind him. He turned to face the girl and held out a purple sword in front of him, and then asked her how she was related to this boy. She didn't answer his questions. In her grimy hand, she clutched a sword glowing the same purple color. But as soon as she approached the man to strike him, he was knocked out of his place by a black-haired youth. She only managed to glance in their direction in bewilderment. The old man's eyes widened and sweat appeared on his face. The husband wheezed from the blow the guy gave him. Mui ran at him, running a sword into the body of the old emperor, and from this blow they were carried away by inertia. Suyang turned in their direction and watched the flight of the man and the guy with her mouth open in surprise. Meanwhile, the Dark Reaper stood rooted to the spot, unable to react. He was in a state of complete shock from this development of events. The face of the black-haired youth radiated a dazzling radiance reflected in blue. With a loud cry, he drove the sword into the body next to him. In the end, their movement ended at a spreading tree. The guy literally nailed the flawless one into the hard bark. The sword he was holding cut its way through the old man's body and passed through the tree to the outside. The man's eyes were bloodshot, as was his mouth, from which red liquid gushed out in a rapid flow. His face turned purple. His eyes rolled back, hiding the irises behind his eyelids and leaving the red whites. The guy in front of him was breathing heavily. He did not look at his victim, but his gaze was directed downward. He placed his right foot on the man's trunk, but leaning on it, he forcefully pulled the sword back, removing it from the old man's body. Driven by a blind rage that clouded his mind, he again raised the sword above his head. Over and over again, he continued to deliver crushing blows to the flawless one's body. His blows sent blood flying everywhere and cracked wood. Yongwa stood in place, unable to move. The defiant expression had long since disappeared, replaced by anxiety. He couldn't believe what was happening. Suyang no longer tried to interfere in the guy's struggle at the risk of falling under the hot hand. She just continued to watch with a frown. She looked at the guy whose eyes had turned from human to something unreal in their anger, and the guy himself looked like demonic animals that he had killed before. Unable to withstand another powerful blow, the tree they were standing near was cut in half and fell with a crash. It fell right in front of the guy's nose, throwing green leaves into the air. The son of the god of death, like a wound-up toy, could not understand why this happened and where the enemy had gone. As soon as he finished with the flawless emperor, he turned his head back. Blue energy flew around him in streams. Yongwa thought to himself that he needed this because this child had just killed Muan, and then noticed that he himself was involved in the death of the Emperor of Death, so he would not leave him alive either. To confirm his thoughts, the guy had already changed his target and was heading towards him, and the aura around him intensified. Now such powerful energy was leaving the guy that its blue light grew like a huge dome in front of the guy, serving as the last barrier. The Dark Reaper raised his sword in front of him, filling it and his armor with a golden glow. But little Tun Fan didn't seem to care. Raising the weapon with its sharp end to the sky, he caused the stones to come off the ground and hang in the air. The man with the orange whites of predatory eyes put his free hand in front of him, as if he was already defending himself. The man nevertheless ran away, but a strange air current reached him, bringing with it the cracks of a destroyed tree. He looked over his shoulder tensely. The boy behind him moved the sharp end of the sword from the sky, and now it was pointing in the direction of the man. This slight movement caused all those stones that had previously risen into the air to fly towards the Reaper, preventing his escape. Yongwa, sensing danger, looked back again where another stone was rushing towards him. He quickly turned around and with a wide swing of his golden blade cut it into small particles. Him continued to cut through the sharp stones that streamed towards him. He shouted to the guy, warning him that if he decided to approach him, he would kill him. But in response to his threat, instead of stones, a stump of a large tree was now flying at the reaper, near which Muan lost his spirit. The Dark Reaper did not expect such insolence and did not foresee that the guy would obey him. He traditionally began to accumulate the energy of gold, which poured into the metal of his weapon, and shouted at the guy, calling him a vile little thing, so that he would not dare to play with him. He swung his sword, sending yellow strokes from the blade into the air, but did not notice that the young man was hiding behind a flying tree. One of the golden strokes did touch the hard wood with its sharp blade. The powerful force of an experienced master with one touch destroyed the flying trunk, behind which reddened eyes immediately appeared. The guy covered his face with the hand free from the sword to protect himself from the stream of finely studied wood that was quickly flying towards him. The guy who broke through the stream of wooden chips pointed the sword in front of him, pointing it at the dark old man. All the man managed to do was gasp in surprise. And suddenly the sharp one penetrated the man's body, causing his blood to flow out in a frantic stream. The guy did not stop there. He continued to hack away at the skin and muscle of the man in front of him, the man who had robbed him of his father. Mui bent down and with him extended the sword that was still in the man's body, thereby cutting him in half. The girl continued to watch all this bloody action. Suyang couldn't stop looking at the young man's actions in horror. The son of the Emperor of Death held the sword of his dead father in his hands, and in front of him on the ground lay the man who had deprived the young man of it. He continued to breathe heavily but silently looked at the bloody corpse that was pouring thick liquid onto the earthen path in front of him. His eyes never stopped emitting a red glow. After he finished with the last enemy, thereby finally avenging his father, he turned his head to the side. He looked at the girl, the only living person besides him in this valley, who was now looking at him in fear. Mui lost himself in grief and anger and now looked like a damned ghost, destroying everything around him. With a blank look he walked towards the girl, but after a moment his deathly gaze was replaced by a tired one. The eyelids began to slowly droop, covering the eyes. Suyang looked at him, not taking her intense gaze off his face. But the girl didn't seem to attract his attention, so he just walked past her, heavily bowing his head sadly. Something in Tanfan's behavior began to change. Hearing strange sounds, the girl looked in his direction. When she turned around, their eyes widened and their mouths widened in surprise. The son of the god of death fell exhausted by the body of the god, and his sword, his divine inheritance, lay at his hand. The girl immediately rushed to him. Mui lay next to Gajjun, whose body began to gain earthly cold, and through any open eyelids, he peered into the face of his dead father. Mui's expression showed no emotion. He was tired after the mortal battle and the stress he had endured, and was now lying on the ground completely exhausted. Finally, the last crumbs of stamina left him, his eyes closed, and his consciousness was enveloped in darkness, through which he heard someone addressing him again and again, calling him master. This appeal was repeated again, but this time louder. Mui's eyes opened wide and bloody lines stood out on the white whites. It was as if he had come to his senses after a deep sleep. The guy was lying crouched on the ground, and the same girl was sitting next to him, but now in a hat and a man with red hair. The girl whispered excitedly to her master, and he, with a flushed face again, called her a ghost and asked her to hit him. The ghost widened her brown eyes in surprise, asking what he meant. But the black-haired man quickly repeated, so that she would not hesitate but would hit him sparingly. Suyang exchanged glances with the red-headed man in silent question. The man next to her looked no less puzzled. She folded her hands into fists without swinging too much and hit him on the back, asking if she was doing that. The guy replied that yes, but it needs to be stronger. Unable to restrain himself, he roared, telling her to exert more strength. But the girl did not have the opportunity to try again. A deep male voice ordered her to leave. Yongwa walked up to Muya, who was writhing on the ground, and kicked him in the stomach with all his might, scaring Suyang. The red-headed hunter looked at the guy with barely noticeable anxiety. But he did not show dissatisfaction, but said that this is exactly what is needed, so let him continue until the young man himself tells him to stop. The redhead rolled his eyes at that statement. He was clearly not happy with this situation, but listening to his client's wishes, he continued to beat the guy with all his might. Suyang, who was standing next to her, closed her eyes and turned around, pursing her lips, unable to watch this. The usually clear blue sky with a scattering of fluffy clouds now seemed to be covered with a yellow film. Mui lay on his back on the grass looking up. Squeezing his eyes shut, he said that the sky was somehow yellow. The red-headed man, folding his arms across his chest and looking at the guy, said that abnormal people have their own quirks and the sky is blue as always. And then he added that the guy turns out to be a real monster and the only pain he knows is killing him when he is beaten. The guy, stretched out on the ground, continued to look at the sky and salty tears began to gather in his eyes. He remembered his father and then, unable to hold on, he closed his eyes, moisture glistening at the corners. Suyang looked at him and silent excitement was visible in her gaze. She led to the guy who stood up, addressing him as Mr. as always. The same one looked in front of him, murdered. Then he returned to the girl and said that in the future they should always beat him as soon as he began to fall into this state. The phantom's eyes sparkled and she asked with joy in her voice that his memory had returned. At the rear gate of the fortress, green bushes were blown up, adding color to the gray landscape of the stone walls. A man in military uniform leaned against one of the walls of the fortress and held a spear in his hands. It was a sentry snoring loudly to the sound of falling drops. In a wide recess in the wall sat an old man with gray hair tied in a ponytail, hiding from the rain, smoking a long pipe. He looked at the smoke coming out of it and was surprised at such a downpour, saying with an indifferent expression on his face that it would be possible not to notice if a person was killed nearby. A tall man in a long white robe entered the passage through the stone tunnel of the fortress which served as the entrance. He extended his hand forward, from which a bright flash quickly flew out. With a quick, precise movement, he hit the neck of the guard who was sleeping at his post. The gray-haired grandfather, who was sipping acrid smoke, asked the stranger what brought the gentleman here in such a downpour. A figure in a white robe standing behind the sitting old man asked what was wrong with this, and really something had to happen for him to come here. To which the old man replied that this is true, otherwise lately people have been walking around here for no reason. A man in a robe asked the old man if his friend was among the various ones. The gray-haired man, taking a drag from his pipe, asked him if he missed him. And then he shamed him that he was waiting for a husband who had abandoned his father, relatives, and even friends for the sake of some girl. The man in the white robe said nothing, bowing his head sadly as the white smoke blew in the damp wind. The old man with coal-black eyes continued his remark, suggesting that maybe he died that time along with the others. But he was interrupted, and the young man objected, saying that the body was never found, which means there is a chance that he survived. But the gray-haired man did not calm down. He turned his head to the other and with barely frowned eyebrows asked why he didn't return. A young figure in white clothes with a downcast gaze replied that he did not know that. The old man turned away and his gaze immediately changed. There was pain in his eyes. He called him out loud, a ridiculous boy. His interlocutor, standing behind with his head down, was silent with a face filled with sadness. Suddenly the hot tube shook sharply, pouring out its meaning consisting of black ash onto the stone floor. The man leaned his hands on his knees and said more to himself that it was time to work. Despite the young man, the old man went to the exit right under the rain dome and said that as soon as a new patrolman arrives, let him wake up this one and leave. The man in the robe asked about the umbrella, but the old man said it was not suitable for his age. He clasped his hands behind his back and walked away, the cool drops soaking his hair and clothes. 4 people stood at the stone fortress. 3 belonged to a girl in a hat, a red-headed burly man, and a black-haired young man. They listened attentively to the other man's explanations about how to get through. Suyang listened attentively to the guide, pointing her finger in the direction that could be useful. Black, usually unruly hair had now become completely wet, and dark strands clung to the face of the guy, whose gaze was riveted on something. This turned out to be the figure of a gray-haired man with a tail on the top of his head, who was looking at the guy in response. The old man approached the new arrivals and stood directly in front of the young man. They looked at each other. Mui addressed the man, calling him an old man and asking if he lived here. The old man's eyes widened at the impudence of such treatment from the young stranger. The husband thought to himself that this guy was completely ill-mannered and was the one who grew up on the poor people's eggplant and rice. He was surprised how narrow-minded boys without family and tribe dared to call him an old man. Unable to withstand this pause, the guy repeatedly turned to the old man, asking whether he was deaf and telling him to tell him or the housekeeper. The old man confirmed but asked who the guy was and where were his manners. Did he crawl out of a ditch? His tirade was interrupted by a servant who, through the open door, asked his panache if he was coming in. The servant came out through the passage to the old man and looked at the guy in surprise. He returned to his master and asked who it was, but he answered a little irritably that he did not know. Mui turned to the old man again, but this time calling him a guardian, and asked why he wanted to leave them in the rain. The guardian answered irritably, asking if he was a complete fool, and said that he really thought that while the old man was talking to him, he himself was standing in the hot springs, and ordered him not to be indignant but to introduce himself. But the guy asked their questions and turning towards the entrance said that they would talk inside, to which the men widened their eyes. Everyone who stood there, including the girl and the hunter, looked after the impudent boy. Behind the hedge were 2 beautiful estates made of dark wood. A voice inside him said that this guy's name was Tongfan Mui. Hearing this, the old man's eyes widened in surprise and he opened his mouth in disbelief of what he heard. He asked the girl who owned the voice to repeat it. He looked at the guy and shouted how dare he use the surname Tongfan. The pale guy looked at the old man a little embarrassed with his dark eyes. The old servant standing next to him looked at the guy and asked, "Where is young Master Gajjun then?" Mui's eyes tensed and her lips pursed. He continued to silently look at the man. The old guardian with a worried look thought that this couldn't be the case. The young man's face was covered with scars, but even so he looked like Gajjun. He leaned towards the guy and hesitantly asked his son Gajjun, to which the young man, looking away to the side, said with sadness in his voice that he had died. This news made the old man stagger and only a servant helped him stay on his feet. Mui continued to explain that at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains, it was a stupid death. Suddenly one strong blow split the wooden surface, creating a network of cracks. The blow was so strong that everyone standing nearby immediately recoiled from this powerful wave. Even though he shattered a large wooden table with one blow, the old guardian continued to shake. He turned to the servant whose name was Mabach. He immediately obediently appeared nearby and the old man ordered him to take everyone out of here. He did not look at anyone, his eyes full of anger fixed somewhere down. Mabach addressed Muya, calling him young master, and asked him to follow him so that he could show him his room. The guy with a pattern of rough scars on his young face did not answer. There was only a hint of sadness in his eyes. The old servant returned to the guy and introduced himself as Mabach and added that in the future the guy could always contact him, but he introduced the owner of this house to Yongju. Mabach then returned to the rest of the guests and asked if they had arrived with the master. The brown-eyed girl politely bowed to her husband and introduced herself as the young master's friend and said that her name was Suyang. The old servant raised his thick gray eyebrows in slight amazement and said that he understood. Then the old man returned to the short servant girl Minji, who had already approached, and said that she should lead the guests to the rest room and be ready to serve dinner. The girl nodded and answered briefly. The girl went to the exit and opening the door returned to the guests and invited them to come here. The girl had already hidden behind the door and the red-headed robust man bowed his head and walked into the passage. Mabach addressed the young master who remained standing where he was. He said because he has many questions for the gentleman but he is most concerned about one. He asked the young man if it was true that Mr. Gajjun died at the foot of Mount Kunlun. Mui's gaze lowered and there was a deep viscous sadness in his eyes. He confirmed the man's words. The tinge of hope in the old servant's eyes faded at this news and he was filled with shock at the realization. He grabbed the other hand with his hand and squeezed it tightly, trying to contain his inner emotion. After a moment, the man controlled himself and bowed deeply to Mui, saying that he was probably very tired after a long journey, so he asked him to rest. The young gentleman followed the old man as he left the room, leaving the guy alone. As soon as the servant left, Mui looked out the window next to him. His face took on a thoughtful expression. Behind the masterfully decorated window glass, the gloomy gray sky sent an endless stream of water drops onto the ground, hitting the glass, flowing down it. A rough man's hand knocked briefly on the wooden door, waiting for an answer. On the other side, they answered his silent question that he could enter. The tall figure of the hunter entered the room, where a girlish figure was sitting at the table looking at the newcomer. Strands of her brown hair lay on her cheeks. She calmly asked the man what happened. Yongwa stood with his head bowed, and there was barely noticeable anxiety in his voice. He said he wanted to ask something. Suyang looked at the man in front of her from her seat. After a short pause, she told him to ask. The hunter raised his eyebrows slightly and asked the girl with interest if the Emperor of Death was Mui's father. Sukyin, with a completely serious look, silently nodded in agreement, confirming the man's guess. But he said with doubt that at the foot of Mount Kunlun Muan and the Demon Emperor the Dark Reaper also died. The girl again did not comment on his words, confirming this fact in monosyllables. Having received the answer to his question, the man's eyes widened, as if he did not at all expect that his assumptions would turn out to be true. The redhead again said that, "Is it really true, and if so then it means that their people are hunting Mui." Then he added more quietly that his son was turning out to be a hero. Suyang asked the man with a note of interest, repeating the last word about the hero. To which the man laughed softly and said that it wasn't quite like that, of course, and then explained that after their deaths peaceful times had come for the first time in a long period. He continued saying that sooner or later the war will start again, but for now people can live in peace without fear for their lives, and Mui is a hero because he was able to return from that battle alive, although it was his father who rid the world of evil. The girl interrupted Yonghan and with a serious look told him to listen. The red-headed ghost calmly waited for the girl's further story without saying a word. And so she said that the Demon Emperor and Muan were killed by her master. The eyes of the stern hunter always widened from unexpected information, and his eyebrows rose high. He looked at Suyang puzzled and stammered and said that this couldn't be done and that this was some kind of nonsense. But the girl said quite seriously that it was true. And then she reminded him to remember how he saw that indomitable power inside the young master. Yongwa immediately fell silent, his face taking on a planned expression. He couldn't believe that a boy who had just turned 18 killed Muan and the Dark Reaper thanks to an explosion of some kind of force. And from this it follows that this young man killed the strongest people in the world 3 years ago. Yongwa exhaled heavily, narrowing his eyes, and then said that he knew that he should have asked for more money. The clear sun sparkled over a small town surrounded by a fortress. Mui was sitting in an empty room by the window. His arms and legs were folded and his eyes were closed. He was meditating and a light blue light was flying around him. He understood that he did not have much time left and the attacks could be carried out at any time in the past. He must accumulate enough strength to master them. He thought to himself that even if he lived longer he needed to master the power within himself at any cost, because he had already lost 3 years due to memory loss. Meanwhile, Mabach stood outside the door asking the young maid if the young master was still sleeping. The girl shushed him, putting her finger to her lips, and said that as soon as he woke up she would let him know. But then the voice of a young gentleman came from the room who said that he was awake and they could come in. The guardian entered the room with the servant. The man walked towards the guy with a calm gait and with his hands clasped behind his back. Mui's eyes widened a little in amazement. He clearly didn't expect his grandfather to want to visit him. The old man stopped in front of the guy. They looked at each other. The husband is studying and the guy is confused. Grandfather seriously asked Mui what he had been doing all this time. The Dark One did not take his black eyes off his grandfather's. The old guardian continued to bombard him with questions about who his mother was and what year he was born. The young man frowned and asked a little irritably about the year and said that he didn't know. He said that he was always alone from early childhood until one day a caring man appeared and said that he was his son. And then he added that on the way here he died, that's all. Mabach, opening his mouth, asked sharply, "I come out he is the son of the woman through whom Gajjun left them." The young man sharply replied that he did not know who they were talking about. Mabach exchanged glances with old Harnadal. The attendant still had a surprised expression on his face while the guardian remained serious. Mui added that would anyone really visit a girl he didn't like? The old man with his hands behind his back calmly asked the young man who his mother was, to which he replied that he had already said that he did not know. The old man's gaze softened a little as he looked at his lost grandson who had such a difficult fate. Grandfather asked the guy again, this time about how he survived. The young man replied that he begged and then was a bait for wild animals on Mount Kunlun. The old man asked with sadness in his eyes, repeating the phrase about bait for animals. The old man standing next to him frowned sadly. But Mui did not continue to explain. He asked a counter-question about why the old man was so interested in the woman who gave birth to the yogi, and what kind of woman he ran away with. At the mention of the woman, the guardian's eyebrows frowned and his gaze became hard. He said that this was the cause of Gajjun's death. Hearing this, Mui's gaze changed. The eyebrows furrowed and a sparkle appeared in the eyes. Dark shadows fell on the surface of the gray stone fortress. A short figure was heading towards the two sentries. An old man with gray hair gathered in a ponytail approached the sentry. He immediately noticeably reborn and asked the master if he had developed senile forgetfulness and where his sword was. The old man handed the young man in front of him a white package and told him to give it to his superior. The sentry asked what it was. The old man replied that it was a letter of resignation. The guard's eyes widened and he asked in surprise, looking at the old man. He approached the old man and holding his shoulder, I asked what happened and why so unexpectedly. He replied that everything was fine, the time had just come and he had already enjoyed the fame. The man continued his movement and told the sentry to work, and he continued to call the old gentleman. The sentry remained standing in place, looking in surprise at the man who had so unexpectedly left his post. Mui was replaying the name Gu Kyoha in his head. He found out that she pushed his father into the embrace of death, and this old man just up and left without answering the question properly. The guy pouted his lips offendedly and said that he would find out about it sooner or later anyway. Mui walked along the lonely corridors. He looked with interest at the elegant rooms of the family home. Suddenly the young man stopped at a door made of dark wood and mentally asked if it was his grandfather's room. The boy carefully opened the door and asked himself with interest when he would have the opportunity to look into it. Mui opened the door with a sharp movement, causing a loud sound. The boy's eyes widened in horror. After he went inside, Muck curled his lips childishly and mocked that it was somehow rustic here. Just as he turned to leave, a strange dark aura caught up with him at the exit. The young man immediately felt it and turned around with slight amazement and peering warily. His reflexes forced him into a stance. A dark, strange energy surrounded him. He mentally wondered what it was and where this evil energy came from. He furrowed his eyebrows and peered intently in search of the source of this energy. He thought that the source was behind the red cloth. He stealthily approached the mysterious red canvas, holding his hands at the ready, thinking that perhaps there was a killer there. As he got closer, his face became more worried and his body began to shake. He turned to the invisible enemy, shouting and asking who was there. Energy flew in heavy clots near him. Unable to withstand this tension and pressure from the ghostly rival, Mui grabbed the first thing that happened by the arm. He picked up a heavy object and swung it, threatening it because behind the red canvas, shouting for him to come out. The atmosphere in the room continued to become heavier and a black aura had already left the entire room. The guy held his improvised weapon and began to approach the canvas with a killing threat. The boy's hand touched the heavy fabric curtain behind which, in his mind, the enemy was hiding. He quickly pulled the fabric, feeling it to the side and swinging the dark object with a scream. His eyes widened in amazement, losing their menacing fervor. There was no one behind the red canvas, which surprised the guy. He held the curtain in one hand and still held the weapon with the other. He exhaled with relief and asked himself with a slight smile what it was, and said that he was nervous a lot. Mui looked at the long wooden case, which was the only inhabitant of this terrible corner. He looked at it with interest, saying that it was interesting and nothing would happen if he just looked. He reached for the lid, but when he opened them underneath, there was nothing interesting. He noticed with disappointment that it was empty. Mui was already returning the lid to its place, thinking that there was something important there. He unclenched the palm in which he had previously held the red cloth, returning them to their place. He turned his back to the strange corner in disappointment and began to walk out of the room again. Suddenly, the tentacles of heavy energy again touched his sensory receptors, and he became alert. The guy frowned and looked towards the red canvas with a dissatisfied look. He continued to peer, thinking to himself that this energy was definitely coming from there. Small Tun Fan again approached the strange wooden chest, opening it, and mentally noticed that it was beckoning like a song of trouble, but as soon as he approached, there was no energy. He began to rummage around in all corners of the wooden container, feeling all its surfaces, but then said that no matter how much you look, there is nothing here. Reclosing the lid of the chest, he suggested that perhaps the energy came from the wood. Unexpectedly, a voice came from behind him and asked if the young master was interested. Mui returned horribly from surprise. An old servant stood in front of him. Mui, with his eyes bulging, said how he scared him, and he must warn him that he had entered. The old man did not pay attention to the irritated guy, but only laughed cheerfully, squinting his eyes. He asked Mui, or did he look inside, and quickly replied that it was empty. The husband said that the box was not empty. The young man snapped irritably at the man, furrowing his eyebrows, asking if he was joking. Mabach again ignored the guy's rudeness as he explained that he was not joking, and in this box was the blade of wind and thunder, the treasure of the wind gate. Muan, not understanding what he was talking about, asked what he meant and what else was behind the wind gate and the blade of wind and thunder. The old man offered to explain. He said that the Tongfan family is known throughout the world as the guardians of the wind gate, and the young master is the only heir of this family. He continued explaining that in the guardian family, the secret art of wielding the phantom sword of wind and thunder has been passed down from generation to generation. Listening to the man, the guy had many questions. Hearing about the sword, he asked what ghostly meant. The husband said that only those who master the ghostly wind technique can use the wind and thunder blade, and only the ghostly wind art can make it noticeable, and those who do not own it will not be able to see or touch the blade. Mabach said that the blade is weightless because it represents the embodiment of the wind. According to the language of the old man's story, the guy's eyes lit up. After such a colorful description of the mysterious sword, he immediately turned to the place where it lay as if it would reveal itself to him. The attendant explained that the ghost blade also cannot be given to anyone but must be kept in a sandalwood box. He also added that only a person who has the blood of the Tongfang family can place it there, to which the guy asked again, which means that now only his grandfather can use this blade. To this question, Mabach smiled and said that no, he could not, since its last owner was Mr. Gajjun, the 38th heir of the Guardians of the Wind Gate. Muan frowned and turned away, mentally saying that it turns out that the blade shows its true form only to those with special power, and immediately thought of the demonic sword. Muan turned around and asked him with a frown on why he was emitting evil energy. The attendant explained that this was because the young man had dangerous power. The guy asked about the power of 1,000 deaths. Mabach nodded in agreement and then added that young Tongfan should get rid of her. He also added that the direct descendant of the Tongfan family should only carry the powers of the phantom wind and the blade of wind and thunder, and now he is the only heir and the fate of the Guardian clan is in his hands. Mui's face was serious as he asked what the man meant by saying that he should get rid of the power of 1,000 deaths. The old man excitedly replied that unfortunately this is impossible, but if you make every effort you can suppress it. The young man tensely asked the old servant who was looking at him what if he didn't succeed, but he only bowed his head and said that then the Wind Gatekeeper's clan would disappear. After a short hesitation, he added that the same participation would await the blade of wind and thunder. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by the stern voice of the grandfather, who loudly asked what they were doing here.